Good evening, everybody present and those out in virtual world. At this time, we are going to reconvene into open session this meeting of the Arlington Independent School District Board of Trustees for August the 5th, 2021, beginning at 6:48 p.m. Due to health and safety concerns related to the COVID-19 coronavirus, members of the public are encouraged to participate by watching the school board meeting online at www.aisd.net. One or more trustee may participate in this meeting via electronic means consistent with the Texas Open Meetings Act and the governor's disaster proclamations related to COVID-19 through proclamations, executive orders, and suspensions of Texas law. At least a quorum of the board will be participating in person, by video conference, or telephone conference in accordance with the provisions of sections 551.125 or 551.127 of the Texas Government Code that have been suspended by order of the governor. Members of the public may access this meeting via AISD website at AISD.net. We will start our meeting with the opening ceremony. Please join Mr. David Wilbanks in leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please silence all cell phones or any electronic devices to avoid any disruptions to those sitting next to you. And now, if you would please join us in a moment of silence. Thank you. Next, we will consider administrative ratifications and appointments. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mace. I'd like for the board to consider the ratification of the administrative appointments as discussed in closed session.
Okay, do we have a motion to approve the administrative ratifications as discussed in executive session?
Motion.
I've got a motion by Ms. McMurrah, a second by Mrs. Fowler. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present vote in the affirmative. Motion passes.
Thank you, President Mace. And so we'll do, because of volume, we'll do an abbreviated version, and you'll see on the screen. And so, new principal at Arlington High School, Ms. Stacy Humboldt, most recently principal of Young Junior High. Carter Junior High principal, Elena Lopez, most recently the principal of Webb Elementary. Principal of Owsley Junior High, Amber Price, most recently the dean at Owsley Junior High. Kristen Lundeen, the principal of Young Junior High, most recently the dean at Seguin High School. Chelsea Brodden, Amos principal, most recently an AP at Blanton. Angela Kilcrease, AP at Ditto, most recently, principal at Miller. Aisha Ramos, the principal at Peach, most recently the dean at Peach. Nancy Zayas, principal of Rankin, most recently the AP at McNutt. Clarita Thompson, principal at Sherrod Elementary, most recently the dean at Workman Junior High. Evelyn Navarro Gaspar, most recently the AP at Peach, is the principal at Webb Elementary. New assistant principals, Sophie Heck, assistant principal at Arlington High School, most recently the AP at Young. Kelsey Wolf, most recently a teacher at Sam Houston, now an assistant principal at Arlington High School. John Espinosa, most recently in Mansfield ISD as a teacher, assistant principal at Martin High School. Jeremy Bentley, most recently an instructional coach at Ditto, is now an assistant principal at Ditto. Diana Jennis, most recently a teacher at Arlington High School, assistant principal at Larson Elementary. And Lori Kane, most recently a teacher at Little, now the assistant principal at Little Elementary. So congratulations to these appointees. They are already hard at work, and so I appreciate them and their dedication to Arlington ISD.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cavazos, and I love seeing that in-house trajectory of leadership. That's great. Congratulations to all of those individuals. The next thing on our agenda is our open forum for agenda items. As stated on the posted agenda, members of the public who desire to address the board regarding an item on this agenda are required to register by sending an email to the Superintendent of Schools Secretary, lbenjami@aisd.net, no later than 3 p.m. the day of the board meeting. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have any requesters registered to address the board regarding agenda items?
Yes, ma'am. Our first speaker is Mr. Stephen Poole.
Okay. As Mr. Poole approaches the microphone, I will read our routine part of the school board. It will apply to anyone speaking this evening, so you don't have to listen to me continue to read it more than once. This is a routine part of the school board's agenda for regularly scheduled meetings. This segment of the meeting provides citizens an opportunity to share their views with the trustees on items that are on the agenda tonight. It is not intended to be a discussion or a debate, and trustees will not reply to speakers. Derogatory comments aimed at an individual will not be tolerated. Personnel matters are not appropriate subjects for open forum. You will have 3 minutes to speak. Mrs. Benjamin will notify you when your time is up, and please end your presentation at that time. Mr. Poole, your time starts.
Thank you, Ms. Mays, for the time tonight. Members of the board and Dr. Cavazos, I'm Stephen Poole, the Executive Director of UEA, and tonight I'm here to talk about the discussion action item C, the revision of DEC local, the Employee Leave and Absence Policy. This is a really good thing that you're doing tonight by adding additional paid leave for any employee who tests positive for COVID and must quarantine or isolate. There's a big fear among employees that if they did get sick, that they would have to dip into their own accrued paid leave or go into unpaid status and lose pay. So this is a great thing that you're doing again for employees, because once the federal leave ended at the end of last year, you extended it for the remainder of the school year. To do this again for employees is going to relieve a lot of employees of that anxiety. There's so much out of their control, so much out of your control. The governor is holding all the cards, it seems. So by supporting your employee this way, along with the 4% raise that you approved, and can't remember what you did last year for raises? Another 4% last year. So 8% total over 2 years, 2 times extending 10 days or more of paid leave. This is the way you support and treat your employees. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Poole.
Our next speaker is Ms. Kim Worley.
Thank you, Ms. Worley. Your time starts now.
Thank you for the job you do, and thank you for the job you do and the time you spend serving our community. Thank you for listening to me, and I pray that you hear my heart. Freedom is never more than 1 generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free. Reagan hit the nail on the coffin in this one. These simple yet extremely powerful words are so relevant in 2021. It is more apparent now than ever that our freedoms as Americans are at stake. Freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of healthcare, freedom to worship, even the phrase, my body, my choice, are all at stake to Americans. It has been almost exactly 2 months since Abbott issued his executive orders. During this time, most Texans, including teachers, have lived life and roamed freely as citizens. For the last 18 months, we have heard trust the science. Well, we're seeing now that the science is being exposed. COVID vaccination effectiveness rates are dropping. Rapid test results have been proven faulty, even being revoked. The CDC has proven to be wishy-washy at best. It is hard to trust the science when it's apparent there's an agenda being pushed and fear is spreading more rapidly than this virus. Fear, false evidence appearing real. What are real are the stats I'm about to read from the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's website and the Joy campaign recently launched by Cook Children's. Since January of 2021, there have been 2 COVID deaths, 56 suicides, and 38 homicides between the ages of 3 and 24. Expanding my research, out of 683 ranging from 3 to 91, 63 COVID deaths, 241 suicides, and 110 homicides. Back to 2020, we're in the deep waters of COVID, 0 COVID deaths, 50 homicides, and 64 suicides in the age bracket of 0 to 24. 82 COVID deaths, 163 homicides, 304 suicides. As of September 2020, 192 kids have been admitted to Cooks for attempting suicide. 99% of the suicide attempts have some over-the-counter component. Anxiety is what brought me here today. My child suffered tremendously during the lockdown. Her anxiety over the last year and a half of school was at an all-time high. Depression crept in. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed. She went from being an incredible student with a desire to learn to not touching assignments for days and weeks.
Your time has expired.
Thank you, Ms. Worley.
Our next speaker is Mr. Andrew Lipscomb. Is Mr. Lipscomb in the room? Is he on Zoom? Okay, Mr. Lipscomb is not available at this time. Our next speaker is Ms. Kim Martinez. I believe she is on Zoom.
Okay. Ms. Martinez, can you hear me? If you can hear me, we cannot hear you. Looks like you're coming up.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay. Ms. Martinez, your time starts now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Good evening, President Mays and the board, Dr. Cavazos. Thank you for allowing me this time to speak this evening. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for canceling the convocation, realizing that this is not the time for unnecessary in-person gatherings, especially gatherings that large. Our community is currently raging again with COVID, and we know that it's really not safe. I really appreciate it, and I know lots of other staff members do as well. We all breathed a big sigh of relief. I do want to express concern, however, for future in-person meetings. I know some of my trainings seem to be online, but then there's others that are going to be held in person. I would strongly beg of you to let us continue to do virtual meetings and for faculty meetings and anything like that, because this Delta variant is so extremely transmissible. And in the absence of the ability to mandate mask wearing, the only thing we can do are all the other mitigations, which is refrain from meeting in person whenever possible, strongly recommending masks, since our governor in his great wisdom thinks that we don't need masks anymore, even though we see that the numbers are rising and there are many breakthrough cases. Also, social distancing and everything when that's possible. And I really hope that we're going to continue all of those other COVID protocols. I was always very proud of our district this past year for exercising extreme caution and doing the contact tracing and doing the quarantine. I just saw that it looks like the TEA says we don't even have to notify people if their child was exposed to a positive case. I don't understand this world that we live in. It's science. This is not about feelings. This is not about freedom. It's much less of a hassle to put on a mask than it is to be intubated. And I really can't understand people thinking that it's false information. Science is not static. Science changes all the time, and we don't always know what we don't always know until we have the data to support it. So it's extremely important that we continue to follow the data. We know that the CDC has changed courses a couple of times, but that's because we learn more and we have to follow what the science says and what does the data say. So therefore, we've got
Ms.
to
Martinez,
change.
your time has expired.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ms. Rebecca Rogers.
And I got all disorganized. Give you a couple seconds.
I'm going to give each of you a copy just so you have it. Okay.
Okay, ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Your time will start now, Ms.
Thank you.
Martinez.
Good evening, members of the board. My name is Rebecca, and I'm here as a parent of a student in AISD whose life was significantly impacted this last year and a half due to the restrictions and mandates that AISD had implemented due to COVID. As we begin another school year, masks are being considered in other districts, and I'm concerned that that's going to be happening here. Sadly, it has become apparent that the mask mandates, vaccination attempts, and CRT push is not about safety, but indoctrinating our kids. Our Constitution was founded on principles of freedom, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When an organization or government entity oversteps those boundaries, they are choosing to take away those personal liberties, not only violating the Constitution, but also violating basic civil rights. They are choosing to discriminate one group of individuals versus another group of individuals. I know you are aware, since it was brought up at the last meeting in May, but maybe over the summer break it's been forgotten. I've provided a copy of the executive order and highlighted the clause that is relevant to my address tonight. On May 18, 2021, Abbott issued an executive order GA36 on page 2, number 1, specifically stating no government entity, including schools, may require a person to wear a face covering or mandate that another person wear a face covering. I would like to hope that AISD and their board are not going to consider re-implementing the mask on our children. They deserve better. They deserve the right to choose whether they want to wear a mask or don't. If a student wants to wear a mask, so be it. If they don't, okay, those wearing it are protected. There is plenty of evidence that masks do not stop the spread of COVID. However, there have been numerous studies that have shown that masks do significantly have negative impacts on physical and sociological impairment of individuals. It is time to stop trying to force those that don't want to wear a mask or take the vaccine to do so and allow people their God-given right to choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Ms. Benjamin, do we want to see if Andrew Lipscomb might be present and/or online?
Is Mr. Lipscomb in the room and not on Zoom? Okay. President Mays, our last person was Ms. Mullins, submitted some papers that were at your place when you came in. She chose not to address the board this evening. Yes. The other 3 speakers are non-agenda items. They'll be later.
Yes, thank you, and we do have that information. Okay. Next on our agenda, our action item, Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mays. And tonight, action item A allows the board to designate officials to be, or an official, I should say, to be a delegate to the Texas Association of School Boards Delegate Assembly.
Mr. Hogg.
Thank you, President Mays. For TASB Delegate Assembly, this is a critical item. TASB is our largest representative organization in the country. Mr. Chapa serves as our board member, doing a wonderful job. And this is for Delegate Assembly. And so the delegates decide what's the path of TASB for the next year. What is the priorities? What's the goals? What are they trying to pass? Which, as we all know, those of us who've been up here a while, sometimes they try and pass some things that are not the best interest of the Arlington Independent School District. So with that, the Delegate Assembly, I would be honored to nominate Ms. Fowler as our delegate and Mr. Wilbanks as our alternate delegate for the 2021 Delegate Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. It sounds like a motion. Do I have a second? Okay. A motion by Mr. Hogg, a second by Dr. Reich. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, let's please vote. All present vote in the affirmative. Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mrs. Fowler. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilbanks, for volunteering to serve and use additional time for the benefit of our students. Thank you. Dr. Cavazos, our next action item.
Thank you, President Mays. The next action item allows the board to consider an endorsement of a candidate for the Texas Association of School Boards Board of Directors.
Mr. Hogg.
Thank you, President Mays. And just on that delegate assembly, I think everyone up on this board, except our brand-new board member, will be served as a delegate. So it's good that our entire board knows the function of what is happening on there, so I appreciate it. And now we get to make the decision. That was for delegate assembly. Now this is for TASB Board of Directors. The board is 40 or so members across the state from very broad spectrum from where it comes. As a former TASB board member, and then we're so served well by Mr. Chapa right now on the board. We have the privilege to endorse candidates that are running. Two candidates are running. One of them that is currently on the board. No offense to Mr. Chapa, she may be the hardest working TASB director I've seen on TASB in many years. Besides you, Mr. Chapa, I know that's it. When you look at incumbent, she works really hard. She's dedicated. She represents Region 11. She also represents a very small rural portion of Region 11, which there is a large portion of our region that does cover that. And she is dedicated to TASB, which can take a lot of time and energy. Right, Mr. Chapa? Very true. So with that, I'm honored to offer up to this board that we endorse and make a motion to endorse Corinne French from Valley View ISD to receive our nomination to our vote, I guess, as officially an entity to the TASB Board of Directors.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. So I have a motion by Mr. Hogg. Do I have a second? Mr. Wilbanks. So I have a motion by Mr. Hogg, a second by Mr. Wilbanks. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present vote in the affirmative. The motion passes. Thank you very much. Very proud to cast our endorsement for Corinne French. She is a very hard worker and once again, definitely has students and the state of Texas education at heart. Okay, next on our agenda are discussion action items. First item, COVID-19 school operations update. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mason. This evening, we bring for board consideration our protocols and our school operations update. And as things continue to change, we know that it's important as we're about to open school for our students to have some calibration, but also clarity around protocols and how we would operate school during this upcoming school year. And so, as you know, there are many restrictions to things that school districts can do and cannot do. And so we've examined those, and we have been calibrating with staff and others to make sure that we're centered on making sure that our students have the best learning experience this school year, and mindful of things that we have to do and things that we cannot do in relation to protocols. So this evening, Dr. Hill will present a summary of our protocols for this upcoming school year related to school operations. Dr. Hill.
So thank you, Dr. Cavazos, for that framing, and good evening, President Mays and board members. Again, the framing has been set, and so I'll just kind of get right into what we're here. And so I'll just kind of start with the overview of what we'll be discussing, the COVID-19 protocols for the 21-22 school year. Symptoms present but not typical is a term that or a phrase that we're going to be using as we process through this work. And then positive COVID-19 cases for students, staff, and the notifications process. Mitigation factors, and then COVID-19 testing. And then we'll just kind of go through that here very briefly. So these are the revised protocols that we brought to you and you approved effective May 26th, and we'll continue these protocols into the 21-22 school year. And they go everywhere from the health screening, which was at one point required, no longer required. The wearing of the mask, no longer required, it's optional. Contact tracing, no longer required. Isolation of confirmed COVID-19 cases will be required, and we'll post notifications for that. The hand washing, the cleaning and sanitizing, normal operations will discontinue the use of the physical barriers, and the COVID-19 testing center will continue. Continue with those protocols, no limited or none or limited in-person meetings. We'll go back to our normal operations with that, with the same thing with visitors and volunteers to campuses, appointments back to normal, closed campuses, which we implemented during that time. We're back to normal operations with regard to that. And then the COVID-19 leaves, it's a documented COVID positive case with a 10-day isolation, and there will be more information about that for both students and staff a little bit later. And then other protocols that are not listed here will be back to normal, normal operations. So we'll talk a little bit about symptoms of illness that are present and not typical. And so these are the terms that we're using with our health services department and working with other just information that we're receiving and considering. If these symptoms are present, some of them are automatically exclusionary symptoms. If you have a fever, if you have diarrhea, if you have things like that, you are automatically excluded from being at school until you're symptom-free without medication for a period of time. Others are symptoms that we're going to ask parents and the community and staff to monitor. And if you're having these symptoms, we're going to ask that you isolate until you figure out exactly what's going on, whether that be with your physician or whatever other measures you can take. But these are the symptoms that are present and not typical if you're having those symptoms, that we would ask you to do some sort of isolation. Then we'll talk a little bit about documented positive COVID-19 cases for both students and staff. And so we'll go down the left column with the student first. If a student tests positive, and that's from a test, that student's absence would be excused. We would require that student to isolate or quarantine for 10 days and return after 10 days and symptom-free. Makeup work will be allowed, and we will do the appropriate other services that would be to make sure that those students get the academic supports that they need. For staff, we would ask the staff to do that same. We would, same isolation period of 10 days. We will require a potential policy modification that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then that same day, isolation for 10 days and return after the symptom-free for that period of time. Notification for COVID-19 cases. Notifications we posted on the district dashboard and the campus website as we've done in the past. We're still trying to iron out exactly what that notification would look like. At the elementary level, the notification will be made to the class or the group because of their, in some elementaries, you don't have the cross sections of kids. They're all there. But at the secondary schools, we would probably just notify the campus because of the changing classes and things of that nature, that there's a case at the campus. No individual will be notified or will be identified as to who the actual person is with the positive case. We recommend that those would monitor those symptoms and again, take the appropriate medical actions with your physicians or others. And get tested. We will again have the district's testing center open and available for us. If you're exposed to COVID-19 positive person, but you're asymptomatic, we recommend that you get tested 3 to 5 days after the last contact with the positive person, even if you're fully vaccinated. And if they become symptomatic, they should stay home until they are tested again. Mitigation factors that we have in place that we'll try to continue to help mitigate this pandemic is continue to have the PPE available at the campus, the masks are available for those who want them, the hand sanitizer available, the opportunities to wash hands and things like that, all of those routine cleanings that are in place. And again, most part is just to encourage symptomatic individuals to monitor themselves and stay at home. Just a little bit about the testing. We'll continue to use the Binex Now antigen test, which is a shallow nasal swab. We'll get those results in 10 to 15 minutes. That testing clinic, which was operational back in the spring semester up at 600 New York, we'll have that back operational hopefully by August 16th, and we'll run it from 9 to 2 a.m. by appointment. And then we'll try to set the appointments early in the morning for the staff so that we can get the information and act appropriately. At this time, that will take questions or discussions that you may have, but that's kind of encapsulates what we're trying to accomplish with regard to the protocol.
So just a quick comment, President Mays, that a lot of this seems familiar because on May 26th, this board voted to change those protocols, and we know that as we went into summer school, which we had thousands of students in summer school, we implemented the protocols you saw as of May 26th. And so a lot of this is familiar. We start distinguishing based on COVID positive and what happens when someone is, and that's what you saw in that distinction. We'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill. Thank you, Dr. Cavazos, for that clarification. Do we have any questions by trustees? Dr. Reich?
Just a clarification. I support everything that I've heard. I was just curious, with it being under discussion action, is there potential action sought?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so then I would move to approve the protocols that have been presented as stand.
Okay, we've got a couple of other people with questions, so
Okay.
Are you making your motion now, or can I notify you after people have?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. Okay.
Yeah.
Ms. McMurray?
I just had a brief question. Is our COVID testing center going to offer a rapid test, or is it going to be a lab-based test in which the waiting period's a little bit longer?
What we have and we've had in place has been the rapid test.
Okay, good. I think that's all I had. Yes. I agree with Dr. Reich's motion, and I would like to second.
Okay. So we have a motion by Dr. Reich, a second by Ms. McMurray. Any discussion? Mr. Chapa?
Thank you, President Mays. I just had one question, Dr. Hill. On the notification of COVID-19 positive cases, there's a bullet point that says notification made to class student group at elementary campuses. What is the scope of that notification? Are we when we say class, are we talking about a classroom, or are we talking about a grade level?
And we will determine what that is, but more than, instances, more than likely the grade level.
Okay. And what's the thinking behind not making it more narrow to the classroom? Because I can see a situation where, we don't want to, and I agree with not wanting to identify individuals, but the counterpoint there is what we want to do is put the ball in parents, beyond the COVID positive individual, we want to put the ball in parents' court, give parents the choice of whether or not to keep their kid out of school. And of course, the broader the scope of the notification is, the less valuable that notification is. So if, I have 3 kids in school, so if I got a notification that was unique to my 4th grader's classroom, I would know that there's 22 other kids in her class, potentially less. And so to me, that gives me a different quantum of information than if notification went to all 126 students in the 4th grade, where I don't know if this was someone my student might not have even come in contact with at all. And I know that there's some mixing in PE and other specials throughout the day. So I would just, if it's possible, I would just encourage the administration to adopt an approach with notification that is as granular as we can get it without individually identifying the students, because my fear is that if we go too wide, that notification is less valuable to the parents, and then we have some parents who are maybe overreacting when they don't need to. They've got this notification for the grade level, so now they're pulling their kids out. So we have a kid whose parents are trying to be cautious, but their kid is now missing school. They know they have the opportunity for makeup work, but that's a suboptimal outcome if the student was not in fact a close contact of a COVID positive student. Whereas at the classroom level, in my mind, that's just much more valuable information. If I, as a parent, know that someone in my student's classroom had COVID, I think I'm more informed to make that decision. I may choose to send my student anyway, unless they're symptomatic. But I would just ask that we take a close look at that, because I worry that doing it too broadly is we are providing a notification, that is not as valuable as we could make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chapa. Mr. Hogg?
Thank you, President Mays, and thank you, Mr. Hill and staff. As we as a board approve this, May 26th, I think it's important our students are learning, back learning, and it's multiple things that come about from that, and it's still a choice if someone wants to wear a mask, which I do think is the correct option from that standpoint. And Mr. Chapa, I understand your reasoning. I think we just have to, and I know you're asking staff to be cautious over that. We got to make sure someone doesn't get, probably inappropriate, wrong to say the scarlet letter, but there's those type of things that can happen. And I know there was some targeting of students last year when that happens. And, you know, we're not healthcare, but like even in STAAR testing, certain number, you don't count that group because it's so small. And when you get down to a classroom of 22, 24 students, those parents are going to find out who quickly in there is in there. So I think, you know, grade level in healthcare, it's usually 50 people is the smallest number you can go with from that side. So I appreciate it. I appreciate staff coming back with these recommendations. This is getting us back to the student achievement of where we need to be and what we need to work on. And I appreciate the thoughtfulness of, you know, I can't say we're back to normal, but working towards this and allowing people still the choice and option to go with this. That's all I'll say.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. Dr. Hill, I've got just a couple of questions. For the makeup work for the students that are having to go home for whatever the period of time is, can they start their makeup work while they're at home, or do they have to wait until they return to school?
We haven't gotten into the specifics of that detail, but I don't see any reason why we wouldn't allow, we don't want them to fall farther behind waiting that period, so we try to take advantage of that. Trying to balance the teacher preparing that to get to the student on a day's notice, so.
I was just going to add that prior to COVID, these are our normal makeup work processes, if you will. So there's a lot of communication with parents, and so when a student is out, sometimes they come for the work, sometimes it's sent home, maybe with a sibling and all that. Sometimes when they come back the 5th or 6th day, that's when they get all the makeup work. Our commitment, though, is that we ensure that students have the same amount of time to complete the makeup work that they were absent.
Yeah.
And that's the fair thing to do, but also get them the support that they need when they are doing that makeup work. So we know that it's well in the system of how makeup work is handled. And to your point, President Mays, during the time they're out, many times parents request that makeup work, mindful of the teacher balance as well for preparation. But we want to make sure the students are successful, to your point, Mr. Hogg. And that's our focus.
Thank you. And then my last question, did you say for our testing site that there would be appointments? You have to make appointments, or could a staff member or a parent bring their student by because they're having symptoms?
We prefer the appointment so that we can make sure that we are appropriately staffed, but I have to lean to the team that will be running that, Ms. Minnerly and her team, to determine if we would take walk-ups. And I don't think we would turn anybody away, but we would prefer the appointments.
Okay.
And no, just to add, thank you, Dr. Hill, that the appointments allow also for wait period and wait time. And we want to make sure that we have good customer service as well, and that we don't overwhelm the staff there with the volume of testing. Appointments is an orderly way to run a testing site that we've experienced, so that there's not a long wait or frustration and things like that, and we move efficiently.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Cavazos. Thank you, Dr. Hill. Once again, we have a motion on the floor. Oh, Mr. Hogg.
Thank you, President Mays. I had one more question. As I was looking on the website, and you mentioned, Dr. Hill, that we're going to post this. Will we post all these protocols? Will we have like kind of a, like, here's where we're going back to normal, because our website's now been updated, and so we don't have the dashboard either. Is that going to be all under a separate section, or how will the public be notified of what our intention is and where we're going?
It's a great question, Mr. Hogg. And so after the vote and tomorrow, we will be sending an FAQ that addresses these items in question answer format. We find that that is somewhat successful so that people get an understanding of the common questions. But we're prepared to send that tomorrow, and we will once the vote is taken and we have clarity around where we stand.
I appreciate, thank you for that. And let me ask another question. I'm afraid I'm going a little too far in the weeds, because, you know, letting parents choose on choice is good. If someone does keep their kid home because they were exposed or things like that, what happens on, 18 days of truancy and things of that nature?
So that actually question has come up to TEA as recent as today. And so in essence, if a parent decides to quarantine because of close contact, then they will receive the makeup work. And it'll be an excused absence, and we'll take it, case by case. But we were encouraged to be mindful of the fact that if a parent is making that decision, the ultimate goal is success of the student, and we don't want it to be punitive. And so we will treat it with makeup work. As with any absences, we are very mindful with our staff of the reason for the absence, and we, have accountability to that as well. So it's an important balance. But for the most part, if they're going to quarantine because of a close contact, then we're going to treat it with makeup work. We're going to excuse the absence until we know something different. That's the approach we're going to take.
And to help our students meet the 90%
That's
that
correct.
TEA requires. Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you. That was my question.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. Mr. Chapa?
Thank you, President Mays. I thought of an additional question that I forgot to ask, even though I had made a note of it. But before I get there, Dr. Cavazos' response prompted a thought, which is and this was something I was getting at with my comment earlier, if we have a parent who chooses to keep their kid home because we send out a notice to the entire grade, but you use the term close contact, but we're not doing contact tracing. If there is a student who we know, the teachers know, was not actually in the classroom or otherwise exposed to a COVID positive student, they're in a totally different class. They're not at recess together, they're not at lunch together. If a parent chooses to keep their student home in that situation, are they still eligible for the makeup work policy and the excused absences?
So, we're going to approach really with positive intent. And so if a parent tells us they've had close contact, or the child has, and quite frankly at school or otherwise, or they have a family member that is positive and the children want to stay home, then we're going to assume positive intent until we know differently. And just to kind of calibrate, pre-COVID, we dealt with absences and reasons for absences and things like that. And so our staff is very astute about understanding the reasons for absences and working with parents. If we find out differently, then obviously that changes if the reasons are not valid, if you will. But in essence, we're going to help mitigate the spread by individual action. So if you're positive, we're going to require you to stay home. If you're exposed and you tell us you're exposed, then we're going to help you get your makeup work if you decide to stay home. And we will continue that as we progress through the year. Again, the makeup work and absences and things like that, and reasons for absences, excused, not excused, all those are normal processes in our system. And it's really adapting them to this period of time. And I think that can be done.
My question is, we know that we service a number of students throughout the district who have severe medical needs in a pre-COVID world, and some of them may have situations that make them particularly susceptible to COVID, but who might not be eligible for a vaccine or can't get a vaccine for whatever reason. What are we doing for that very limited number of students who the parents, they have a reasonable belief that going to school at the beginning of the year this year would pose particular difficulties for their child?
So we would, again, treat that case just like we would in any other situation with that student. We try to work with them, again, trying to pursue, going down the avenue of positive intent and making sure that we do everything that we can to have that student successful within what we're allowed to do.
So, yeah, I would just add, Dr. Hill, that I think what you're describing is unique situations. And with unique situations that you're describing, we have a number of tools already built in that the state allows that we would fully utilize. But I think the better frame, I think, for all of that is that absences, we work with the parents, we work with the students, we work with the families. Reasons for absences are very important. When we have doctor's notes and things like that, there's a whole system that our health officials there, led by Annette Minnerly, I'll have to point her out today, are used to. And so back to the word normal was used, I think in terms of these systems with health and absences, it's pretty normal that we implement them even pre-COVID. So we do take care of our students and our families, and that's our focus because we want our children to be successful ultimately. And we have many tools to accomplish that, and that's our aim.
Thank
Those
you,
are all the
Dr.
questions I
Cavazos.
have. Thank you, President Mays.
Thank you, Mr. Chapa. Mrs. Fowler?
Thank you, President Mays.
Mrs. Fowler, I apologize. Press your button again. Thank you.
Thank you, President Mays. I want to make sure, are the testing free? Is there any cost to any individual?
No, it's totally free, yes.
Okay.
No cost.
And second question, I think, Dr. C, you touched on this. If we have a family member, a student that comes down with COVID, are we going to ask that the brothers and sisters quarantine, or are they going to keep coming to school until they test positive?
That's what we're going to lean to what that it's a choice that the parents would make. Yes.
And we're going to ask them, because these are conversations that nurses have with families, they've had them last year. We're going to ask them to monitor, we're going to advise the parents to monitor those, understanding that there's a contact at home, and explain the options. That if they want to quarantine, they will be given makeup work. And if for some reason the students come to school and they experience symptoms, then we monitor those and we then take action there with fever and otherwise, using the same tools we just described, including testing. And testing is optional, but there are some conditions, as you heard today, where we can require students to stay home. And those symptoms, we will do that. And again, that a lot of that is also pre-COVID with those that hasn't really changed in terms of fever and diarrhea and things like that. So it's really working with the family unit by our nurses, and thank you to our nurses. And I'll just say this, thank you to this board for having a registered nurse at every campus that is a resource and a valuable asset in our district. But those conversations exist with the family members, the children and things like that. So that's how we would handle that, Ms. Fowler.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fowler. Mrs. McMurray?
I just wanted to quickly note that I appreciate that our makeup work policy for, today's conversation coincides with any absences.
Exactly.
Makeup work, because like Mr. Chapa said, and I think all of us have briefly mentioned, the isolation factor. We don't want our students of any age to come back to school, and the speculation runs rampant. And I mean, we all know it's happened, and it's not just in schools, and it's in workplaces. And we don't want that for our children. And so I really appreciate that the makeup work policy coincides with what already exists in our district-wide makeup policy. So if I were absent for any reason, this would be the same structure. So thank you for being intentional about that.
Thank you, Mrs. McMurray. I do not see any additional lights. Once again, we do have a motion on the floor made by Dr. Reich, seconded by Mrs. McMurray. We've had discussion. I see none. So at this time, let's vote. All present vote in the affirmative, and motion passes. Dr. Hill, once again, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's very clear from the information that's been presented that the intention behind what we're doing is, first of all, to make sure that our students can continue to remain successful. Education must continue in whatever format we're delivering it. The intent behind this is also to make sure that we keep safe not only our students, but our teachers. And when we're keeping our teachers and our students as safe as possible, we're keeping our community safe. And I think as a public institution, that is also part of our job. So once again, thank y'all very much for working on this. Thank you to the board for supporting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next on our agenda, Dr. Cavazos, our resolution for temporarily amending policy DEC local.
Thank you, President Mays, and this policy is connected to our previous discussion as well, and that is to temporarily amend DEC local that will allow us the authority to not make staff that are COVID positive have to take their days or their hours and that we would cover it. And there's experience with this with the board because you've done this before, and it's a tribute to your dedication to our staff. And so we bring this resolution once again for your consideration for this school year for that purpose.
Thank you, Dr. Cavazos. Do I have a motion? Oh. Would you like to make a presentation, Dr.?
I have it prepared. It's prepared, so.
Go right ahead.
He almost did, Mr. Hug.
Thank you again, Dr. Cavazos, for the frame. And so we're looking to temporarily amend policy DEC local. Again, this resolution, because of the continued impact of the pandemic that will likely cause staff to quarantine, previously addressed by the now expired FFCRA, which was discussed earlier. And it's really framed around paying employees for time missed due to a positive COVID-19 diagnosis, which enhances morale, reduces turnover, and reduces exposure to unemployment claims or other workers' compensation claims. And so effective immediately upon approval, this applies to any employee, full-time or part-time, who provides a positive test, evidence of a positive COVID-19 test, and they would be immediate paid leave for equivalent of 10 calendar days, or 10 work days that they are in that isolation period. So again, the administration recommends the board approve the resolution, which you all have a copy of, amending policy DEC local.
And Dr. Hill, just for a clarification, it's 10 days,
Yes.
and any work days within those 10 days is what we're covering. So if there's 2 weekends there, then it'd be 6 days.
6 days.
Right? So it's within that 10-day period. If there's a work day, some of our staff does work on the weekends, any work days will be covered by the district. Just a quick clarification.
Yes, thank you for that.
Okay, Mr. Chapa.
Thank you, President Mays. Dr. Hill, thank you for your presentation. This is, as we did this last year, this is the right thing to do for our staff. It helps mitigate the risk that someone feels like they need to come on campus and work to get paid when they have COVID, and that, you know, we're trying to have as much of a normal year this year as we can, and the more we can do to contain spread and keep it out of our campuses, the better, and this is an important tool in that. And as Mr. Poole said earlier, it's also an important way to show our staff that we are trying to work with them in this difficult time. And so with that, I would move to approve the amendment as presented.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Chapa. Do you have a second? And a second by Ms. Fowler. Mr. Wilbanks.
President Mays, I'd like to amend Mr. Chapa's motion to add the following resolution. Whereas the U.S. government has declared a national emergency and the state of Texas has declared a statewide disaster regarding the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and whereas the Texas Education Code 11.151 gives the Board of Trustees the exclusive power and duty to govern and oversee the management of the public schools of the district, and whereas the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, known as FFCRA, provided additional paid leave due to the COVID-19 symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis, and whereas the FFCRA expired December 31st, 2020, and whereas the pandemic continues and Arlington ISD believes it is in the best interest of the district that those who test positive for COVID-19 should not be at work. Whereas all district employees, contractual and at will, contribute to the achievement of the educational mission of Arlington ISD, and whereas paying all employees for time missed because they are sick due to positive COVID-19 test will enhance morale, reduce employee turnover, and reduce district exposure to unemployment or workers' compensation claims, and be it resolved that the Board of Trustees amends for the 2021-2022 school year the board policy DEC local, effective immediately, to provide as follows. This policy amendment applies to any employee who provides evidence of a positive COVID-19 test result shall be placed on paid leave immediately for the equivalent of 10 calendar days. Full-time employees shall be paid for the days they are on paid leave and at their regular rate of pay for those days on paid leave. Part-time employees shall receive pay for the number of hours of paid leave that the employees work on average over that same period. The board reserves the right to reconsider or amend this resolution as needed, adopted upon adoption of this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. So Mr. Wilbanks did amend your motion to add the reading of the resolution. So Mr. Chapa, would you like to just amend your motion to include the reading of the motion, of the resolution? And I will turn your mic on to answer that question.
That's fine with me. Whatever prevents us from having to do a vote on the amendment and then a vote on the main
Yes.
motion.
Correct.
And I concur.
Okay, so there is a motion on the floor from Mr. Chapa, seconded by Mrs. Fowler, with the inclusion of the resolution. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present vote in the affirmative, and the motion passes. This time, Dr. Hill, remain where you are. Our next action item, consider TASB Board Policy Update. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, President Mason. This evening, we bring the TASB Board Policy Update, including other policies as well. And so this policy update, as you're familiar with, comes from TASB, and it is reviewed by our Governance Committee. And so this has been reviewed by Governance Committee and by staff, and Dr. Hill will lead us through a presentation, and we recommend at this time at this meeting the adoption of these policies if appropriate.
So thank you, Dr. Cavazos, for the frame again as well. Policy Update 117 encompasses, again, legal and local policy changes and recommendations from the Texas Association of School Boards. This comes out periodically throughout the year. Again, the legal policy updates are changes in laws. Legal policy should not be adopted by the board, but only reviewed and presented to staff for implementation. The local policies do need board action to adopt, revise, or repeal. In Update 17, there are 31 policies, 26 legal, 4 local, and 1 exhibit. Administration also recommends changes to 3 additional local policies that will be presented here for your consideration as well. Just the process for review of the policies, appropriate staff, including the Board Governance Committee and our General Counsel, has reviewed the legal and local policies. We've discussed these recommendations with TASB in their policy division and provided feedback on some of the changes that we've recommended. Just a closer look at some of the revisions. BBD exhibit, revision to the board member development framework. CHE regarding purchasing and acquisition. It reorganizes to focus on required vendor disclosures and contract provisions. The 1E HBAC legal deals with special education students and requires a district to notify TEA within 30 days of an ARD committee's decision to place a student in a residential education program. And again, these are things that our staff has been presented with and are well aware of and prepared to implement for this coming school year. Some of the local changes, local policy changes regarding CH, purchasing and acquisition, delegates the authority to the superintendent to contract for replacement, construction, or repair of equipment or facilities in the event of a catastrophe, emergency, or natural disaster that's affecting the school district. And so gives the superintendent that authority to do so in lieu if there's not a board meeting, but to notify the board and get the appropriate approval at the next board meeting. DEC, compensation and benefits, due to the events of the past 2 years, additional flexibility regarding administration of leave is added. Again, we just talked about that a little bit earlier. DEA, dealing with compensation and benefits, addresses employee payments for closures that extend beyond 5 days, as well as a premium pay for disasters for hourly employees. And you've had an opportunity to review these. The other policies that we're bringing forward are EIC in the area of academic achievement. This adds P-TECH for the weighted credit as a part of the early college high school program. And then GKD, Community Relations, adds a provision that aligns with federal regulations regarding limited open forum for non-school use of district facilities. Again, we brought that to you a little while back, and this just adds a little bit more clarity to that. So as mentioned earlier, administration recommends the board approve local policies presented in Update 117, as well as the additional policies recommended from administration for your consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, for that presentation. Mr. Chapa?
Thank you, President Mays. The Governance Committee reviews these proposed changes from TASB for Update 117. To summarize them in general, I would say that these are continuing TASB's ongoing updates to align our policies with our current practices, best practices, and changing events like Winter Storm Uri and COVID. Most of these changes are technical in nature. There was one policy recommendation from TASB that legal recommended we not adopt and is not here. We're not adopting because it would conflict with the conflict resolution procedures the board's already been using and constructed over several years and have served us well. Beyond that, I would at this time move that we adopt the TASB Update 117 and other local policy changes as presented.
Okay. I've got a motion by Mr. Chapa. Is there a second? A second by Dr. Reich. Any discussion? Mr. Hogg?
Thank you, President Mays. And Mr. Chapa, I just have one question on clarification. You said it, and I think you said it the way I'm thinking. Because when I look at I'm talking CHE local, the one you said we're not recommending. In there, it's still redlined, but that will not be redlined and deleted, correct? It's just redlined. That's what TASB was recommending, but we're not. I'm just making sure because it is redlined in there. That's right. Okay, so that will stay in. Perfect. That's the only clarification I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. Once again, we've got a motion on the floor. Motion by Mr. Chapa, second by Dr. Reich. Any discussion? I see none, so let's please vote. All present, vote in the affirmative. Motion passes. Dr. Hill, thank you so much for your time this evening. Okay, we will continue on our agenda. Next, we have items to be withdrawn from the consent agenda. Are there any items to be withdrawn from the consent agenda? Okay. So tonight, we will be considering the items listed on your agenda under consent. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, President Mays. And so Darla will tell us about our consent items, and if there are any questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Cavazos, President Mays, trustees. Tonight, we have donations in the amount of $180,000, $180,024.76 we're bringing to you for your consideration. We also have several bids and several items over $50,000 for your consideration tonight as well. It's that time of the year, so we have a longer list for those tonight. And administration recommends approval of all of the consent items tonight.
Thank you, Mrs. Moss. Is there a motion to accept the consent agenda? Mr. Wilbanks?
I'd like to make a motion to accept the consent agenda, but I had a few questions about the financial report that was included in the consent agenda. If we could ask questions either now or after the vote.
Second, and then discussion.
Right, so you are making a motion.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got a motion by Mr. Wilbanks. Do I have a second?
Second.
A second by Mr. Hogg. Any questions? Mr. Wilbanks?
Thank you, Ms. Mays, President Mays. Ms. Moss, I do have a few questions. It seems like there was a little disconnect between the accruals that we're making over the next couple of months and the revenue that was presented in the finance report in the consent agenda. So if you recall, back in June, we talked about a $587 million surplus, revenue, and $33 million in surplus as the result, and that differs from what was presented as the 6/30 year-end results. So obviously, we're missing a few accruals, but I assume those will sum up and come up to what we were expecting, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And let me, just for clarification, I wouldn't call it a disconnect. It's basically the way we handle the accounting in a school district. We did give you a forecast of what revenue should be. We do know what we will receive from TEA. We don't know exactly how much because it's based on the number of students and our ADA and what that results in. We make that calculation and then we post that to the books. You could do it a couple of different ways. And in previous school districts, I've done it differently than Arlington does it. I actually set up a receivable for that revenue. You could do it either way. Either way, the bottom line is still not going to be set basically until October, November, when you receive the audit from the external auditors. We can post that revenue in June, and you'll see it under the revenue, but there's still expenditures that need to match that revenue that are not going to be posted. For instance, we're July 1 fiscal year district. We still pay teachers in July, and those expenditures are not posted yet. That payroll accrual is not posted yet. We pay them in August for this last fiscal year. So it's just the accounting and how it kind of lines out. Actuals, when we give you an actual on the financial report, it's actually what we received. That's how we've done it in Arlington in the past.
Okay. Yeah, that still seems like a little bit of a disconnect because I'm fine if we choose that method, but then if our actuals really don't reflect expenditures in revenues that were encumbered as of 6/30, that's as of, say, May 30th, then maybe putting that on, not actually stating that it was 6/30, or the other alternative at a minimum is putting an asterisk and putting a note where, we're expecting these accruals that will occur in the next month or so, because it's, I think under accrual-based accounting, and the way I work with FP&A departments at large companies in my consulting job is under the accrual method, if the trigger for that revenue or expense happens in May, then you accrue for those revenues and expenses in May. In this case, I assume that the trigger for that would be the attendance. We're getting paid on attendance of students who attended and teachers who actually worked in May. And so in your professional opinion, you said you've worked in both systems. What would be the preferred method versus maybe just what we've done before?
And again, it's just a preference. For me, I prefer to actually post the receivable for the revenue, but I'm not going to post the receivable every time for the expenditure side, so it's not always going to match up. I will tell you that governmental accounting is different from the private side. I've worked on that side as well.
And I'll plead ignorance
It's a
on the
different
government
animal.
side. Yeah.
So I think it's just understood that we're working on that until you get an audit in November, that those numbers will change. Every time we bring you the actuals for June 30th, it's going to change until we, there's some invoices that post in July for that June 30th that we don't have yet, we haven't received yet, and then we have to accrue them back to last year. So that actual is just basically what we've received as of June 30th. Just as if we give you a report in January, what we've received as of January 31st, that's what the actual number is.
Yeah, I think, under in general with accrual-based accounting, just obscuring if you don't do the accruals and the receivables, then that doesn't give you a true picture of what the operations of the organization, be it governmental or a company. And my preference as a board member in terms of having useful information that we can do our proper oversight, I personally would prefer showing the accruals with the receivables as you were used to at your prior jobs. And I think I would just like to maybe look at this and have you guys come back and recommend what you think would be the best approach, in addition to the fact that it would be nice for us making a decision to not only have the current year-to-date numbers on the actuals, but also the prior year-to-date for the same period, so we can have some frame of reference to know if maybe something's off, that had unexpected expenditures and just so we properly audit that as board members.
And
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, if we could, yeah, maybe just have you guys make a recommendation of what your staff's comfortable with, if you would recommend a change, or at least put a note, and maybe look at how we can revamp that report altogether.
And I will tell you, we've been working on that. Alice Hamrick is here. She's our Executive Director of Financial Services. She can tell you that we've been working on how we're going to even present the financial report. The financials as it's been presented to you is going to change. We'll make sure that, you know, we report that out to Dr. Cavazos, how we're going to change it, how it's going to look, what we're going to put in the report. But it does need to be updated and changed, and we're working on that right now. Of course, we will keep you informed in any changes that we make. I will say, on the actuals, again, we have not received that money from the Texas Education Agency. So what we're reporting on actuals is the actual number for revenue. When we give you those forecasts, that's us letting you know where it's going to land. When we put it as a monthly financial report, we're just saying, here's what we've received for this month. And again, we could do it either way, and we can have more discussion on that, and
Yeah,
we'll update those reports as well.
Yeah, you guys are the experts, and I trust you guys, but I know I'd be more comfortable if it was a receivable. And then if we have to true up when the money comes in, we true up. But I think that would more accurately reflect our operations month to month as we get that report. Thank you.
I'm sorry. The timing was weird. Okay, so once again, we've got our motion on the floor. Mr. Wilbanks made the motion, Mr. Hoggs gave a second. So I see no additional questions, so at this time, please vote. All present, vote in the affirmative. The motion passes. Mrs. Moss, thank you very much for the presentation. And I would probably make a recommendation, Ms. Secretary, Mr. Wilbanks, from what you said, is that this is something that maybe we can funnel through our Finance Committee, and they can make those recommendations so that we're all on the same page of exactly what we're looking for and asking for. Okay. All right. Next on our agenda is a discussion item for the STAAR results update. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, President Mason. This evening, we bring an update on our STAAR results and our instructional response to those STAAR results. We know that last year has already been said, and everybody has experienced, has been very challenging. And so as our students took the STAAR test, not all the students took the STAAR test, but we do have some results. We also know that we have to put those results in perspective based on the fact that we were in a pandemic last year. And so the whole scope of this opportunity tonight is to really begin a comprehensive discussion at the board level about our accountability, how our STAAR results that we know today factor into that accountability. And then, I won't say more important, but as important, then our response to what we have seen with our STAAR scores. Because our response is the way we're going to ensure that students are successful. We also know that that STAAR results under a pandemic from last year is not really punitive. And so we look at it as an opportunity for us to understand the learning that has taken place, the learning loss that has occurred, but also the opportunity to accelerate our students. And our focus this year is strongly around accelerating our students. And there's ways to accelerate students, and so you'll hear some of that tonight. And then ultimately, you'll hear the wraparound service that we have with our campuses from our Office of School Leadership and the work that they're doing to ensure that there's clear alignment in the organization related to our score results and also our instructional response, because those things really work hand in hand. So the beginning may be a big review for our board, and we understand that, so we're going to try to move efficiently. But it's really how the accountability system works, because it's important. In 22, spring of 22, we will have accountability results, and it will be meaningful, and it will have both consequences and things like that. So we try to put it into context. The reason I say it's the beginning of a comprehensive discussion is because we have also talked about the fact that we would have a work session to continue this discussion, to deeper into this the results and the strategies, and then ultimately throughout the year, how we report back to our board about how our students are performing through curriculum assessments, screeners, mid-year data, and beginning of year data, so that it becomes clear to all of us where our students are, where they're progressing, and are they making the progress needed to be successful at the end of the school year for 1 year of success or more. So it's in that spirit that we start our presentation, and I'll turn it over to Natalie to start us on this presentation. And the first part, like I said, is a review, so thank you for your patience. We'll go through the accountability as swiftly as we can. So, Dr. Lopez.
President Mays, members of the board, and Dr. Cavazos, thank you for your time today, where we're going to review the state accountability system and our STAAR results. I'm going to just touch on the A to F accountability and the STAAR results, and then it will pass it on to Dr. Wurtz and Dr. Brown to take that information and tell you, okay, where we're at and then where we're headed with that. So to start with the accountability system, there are 3 domains. Domain 1, student achievement. Domain 2, which has 2 parts, A and B. Domain 2 is school progress. The A portion is student academic growth. The B portion is campus or district relative performance. And then Domain 3, closing the gaps. I'm going to go into each of those domains. So I'll start with Domain 1, student achievement. For elementary and junior high schools, that's going to be 100% STAAR results. For high school and districts, that's going to be broken into 3 components. 40% is the STAAR results, 40% is college, career, and military readiness, and then 20% is the graduation rate. So I'm going to look at the district percentages. So we'll start then with that STAAR component, that's the 40%. How is that calculated? So I don't want to go specifically into each number, but this was our 2019 values. And so what you have here is in this first row, you see your number of your assessments in each of those subject categories. So reading, math, writing, science, and social studies. And at the end of that first row, you'll see a value 95,932. And that's the number of assessments added up in each of those subject groups. The next row is the approaches grade level or above. So that's going to be also broken down by subject and what is the number of the tests that were approaches grade level or above in each of those subject groups. That is also then summed up at the end of that row. You'll see 70,670. The calculation next to that is the percentage. And that comes from taking that 70,670, dividing it by the total number of assessments, and that's where you come up with that 74%. The meets is that same calculation, so a sum across that row to give you that 43,241, and that's meets grade level or above. Divide that 43,241 by your total, and then that gives you that 45%. And then the same formula for masters, the 19,556, which is the sum across all the grade levels, and then divided by the total. So that's 74, 45, and 20%. You add those all up. That gives you 139 percentage points. Divide by 3 because we want an average. And so that average is your component raw score. That's a 46. That raw score is then scaled, and that scale score is shown here. It's a 78. So you'll kind of see that with all the domains. You're going to get a raw score, and then that's going to get scaled. Okay, that was the 40% of the STAAR results. Just to kind of talk about the performance levels that we just discussed, approaches, meets, or masters. It's important that all your students pass the test. I mean, we want students to be passing assessments. And in Texas, the approaches grade level is considered passing. But even if all of your students, so the second column here shows you 100% of your students are at approaches grade level or better. But if none of them are in meets grade level or more, and none of them are in master's grade level or more, when I do that same calculation, 100 plus 0, and then I divide by 3, The raw score that I would get from that doesn't scale to give me a passing score. A 58 would be a failing score for that portion of the domain. So that's important to look then over at the other two scenarios where we have some students moving into meets and masters, 30 and then 10% in that second scenario, and then in the third scenario, 50% in meets, and then 30% in masters. So it kind of just shows you how that calculation can give you a raw score and a scale score. So want to encourage growth regardless of where you're at. Grow into the different levels from wherever you were last year. Now, going back to domain one for the district, 40% was STAAR. Well, another 40% of that is CCMR, College Career Military Readiness. There's the different bullets on there, AP scores, IB. I won't list them out. I mean, the requirements are listed. Performance on TSI, SAT, ACT. And then you have the career components there, industry-based certs and graduation codes and other things. So those are getting those points count for an additional 40%. And then the final 20% of domain one is graduation rate. And that's gonna be your state graduation rate. What the system does is it takes the best of your 4, 5, and 6-year graduation rate. So when you take those three different components and you look at the calculation, this just kind of shows you what we did in 2019. So I've included the raw, but the scale is what actually is used for the calculation. So I'm just going to skip over. So for STAAR, that 78%, 78 scaled score is going to then be weighted 40%. And then that gives you your weighted points of 31.2. CCMR is the same calculation, and then graduation is also calculated in the same way. So then you sum up those weighted points from each of those categories. That gives you your domain one student achievement scale score. Moving on to domain two, there's the two pieces there. So you have that student academic growth, which is A, and then you have that campus or district relative performance, which is B. So student academic growth, what that's gonna do is gonna take, where were you last year? What's your prior year performance level? And then where are you this year? What's your current year performance level? And then it's going to kind of categorize students based on those performance levels. Then there's this additional step where it takes the actual scale score gain from last year to this year and then determines, okay, does that give you a full point or a half point? Some of these options, there's no points. For example, if you're a master's grade level last year and then you fall down to meets grade level on your current year test, you'll notice, let me see if I can do this laser pointer here. You'll notice that if you do that, if you go from masters to meets, you regress, you're not gonna get a point for that, okay? If my prior year performance isn't quite up there on the top end, okay, I have all of these opportunities for points, and then I want to visit about that here in just a little bit. So I just kind of wanted to show you the matrix, the performance level in addition to the actual gain from scale score last year to scale score this year is taken into consideration for the academic growth for students. So this is just an example to show you what our 2019, where our students fell. You'll see that same information, just way more granular with the values of this is their prior year performance, and then across the top here is their current year, and then the different scenarios for half point, full point, or no point. So this calculation takes all of these students, gives them their growth point, and then gives a total growth point earned for, in this case, the district. So that 32,192.5 are the points, not students. And so then they're gonna divide that by the total points that you had the option to get. That gives you a percentage, which is the raw score here, and then that raw score is scaled. Okay. Now, the second part of domain two is that B portion, that campus district relative performance. What that's gonna do is it's going to take campuses and districts and then groups them based on similar socioeconomic status, economically disadvantaged percentages, and then it creates the cut points for the scaled scores for this domain. So this is an example pulled from the manual that just shows, this is a campus example. It shows that each percentage of 0 to 100 has its own row, and you then go through that row based on the level to determine the cut points that would be used to take that raw score and turn it into a scale score. So for AISD, for us last year, 2019, our percent economically disadvantaged was 72.8. That put us into that 72.1 to 73 row. We then take our STAAR score and our CCMR, we average that to give us our raw score, which was a 52. We then use that row and to go find, okay, where would the scale score be based on this raw score cut points for this SES percentage. So a 52, you can see that that would put us, which did put us, let's see, in between this 45 to 54 range, which means we had it in between an 80 to a 90 score. We are closer to the high end, a 52 is closer to the 54, so we actually had a higher B value, so we were 88. The next domain is domain 3, closing the gaps. That's going to take all of our student groups, break them out, and then give them targets based on different components. So there's 4 components for each level. I've listed all 6 of them, but all 6 do not go into each level. I'm going to show you on the next slides which ones go into each of the different levels. So for elementary and junior high, those student groups have targets for these 4 components. So academic achievement, that's going to be your percentage it meets or above in reading and meets or above in math. And that's 30% of the domain 3 score. Then STAAR growth, that's that academic student growth in reading and then in math, that's going to be 50%. English language proficiency, which is TELPAS, that's 10%. And then a student achievement domain score. So that's basically domain 1 broken out by student group, that's 10%. That's elementary and junior high. So for high schools and districts, it's a little different. Academic achievement, which is meets or better in reading, or meets or better in math, is 50%. Federal graduation status is 10%. That English language proficiency, which is TELPAS, is 10%. And then the remaining is the college, career, and military readiness for 30%. So this slide shows you the different targets for the subgroups in each of those components. So what you'll see is, just gonna walk through here, that for the all student group, for reading, I need my percentage at meets or above to be 44 in order for me to hit that target and get a yes. I can then follow the chart, okay, for my African American students for reading, at meets or better, I need to get 32% to get a yes. And then you just follow along that there's different targets for each subgroup, and then you have to hit that target. It doesn't matter if you hit the target, 10 above the target, a yes is a yes, a no is a no. You either hit it or you don't. So those are the targets for the different groups. Now, there has been an adjustment to the federal graduation status, which I'll visit on here in just a moment. So again, this is a calculation example similar to the ones that I've shown. So you take this total met of the targets. So for this first example, in academic achievement, that's the percentage at meets or better. In reading, we hit 8 of the 14 groups that we were eligible for. And then in math, we hit 9 of the 14 we were eligible for. We sum that up, that's 17 out of 28. That was 61%. That's weighted, remember academic achievement is 50%, so that 61 is weighted 50%. That brings us over to this score of 30.5. The CCMR component is calculated in the same way, the number of targets over the total eligible, weighted by that corresponding percentage. And then once I have my different component scores, I add those all up and I get a raw score. That raw score is scaled. So in this case, we had a 63, that scaled to an 80. So the scaling process is just basically it's creating a letter grade system from the raw scores. So a lot of those raw scores weren't corresponding to those traditional A to F values that we're used to, and so this system just creates, the scaling system creates that familiar, values that we're used to in education. And then the scale scores are created based on type and level. So this is just an example, a snip of, here are the formulas for the different levels. This is a district example. And so the raw scores with those corresponding cut points for those different levels and areas go into these formulas. What you would expect is that low values, this red area down here, a raw score of a 36 or a 38, that's going to scale to a failing grade, which in this case is 59 and 55. The higher values, the higher raw scores, are going to scale to that green section, 91 and 90, which would be an A. This is just an example. These are not values taken from a chart in the accountability manual. So then our overall calculation in 2019, if you'll recall, we have our domains 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. We have our scaled scores because the raw scores are just used to create these scaled scores. So we take our scaled scores and we're looking specifically at school progress, so 2. So which one's better, A or B? In this case, B was better. We had an 88. That was higher than a 79. We're going to take that one and bring it over. So now, how does 2 compare to 1? Well, 2 is 88. The student achievement is 79. 88 still higher. That's the one that's going to get pushed over. That value is what we're going to weight by 70%. Remember I said in the beginning, the better of 1 or 2. So that gives us those 62 weighted points in that first half. And then the closing the gaps, that's the unavoidable. There's no option there. That one's going into the calculation, and that's 30%. So we had a scaled score of an 80. We multiply that by the 30%, we get 24. So that brings us to our overall value when we add these together of 86. So for the 2021 STAAR results, that's kind of one piece of the puzzle. Had we had accountability ratings, it would have been 40% of domain 1. There was no way to get it into 2A. TEA did try. They kind of come up with a 2-year growth, but then the cut points and the scaling didn't correspond, and so it couldn't have been anything for 2A. It would have been 50% of 2B at the district level, and then 50% of domain 3. So I'm going to move into those STAAR results. So what you have here is a chart. It shows by the subject group. In 2021, this blue section, you see your approaches, meets, and masters percentages, and then it says domain 1. This is just that STAAR portion of domain 1, that 40%. But that's broken out by subject group. So let me walk through this right quick. So 61 were at approaches or more, 37 were at meets or more, 14 were at masters. And then when I average those for all of my reading tests, I end up with my domain 1 score for just the reading portion. That was a 37. Well, in 2019, you have the same information, approaches, meets, and masters, the domain for just that subject group. And then in this final column here, you see the difference, 2021 minus those 2019 scores. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we have some decreases, and that those decreases are across the subject areas. The next few slides are going to follow a similar format where we actually dive into each subject group by grade. So you'll notice the grade is first, the subject is second, that domain 1 score from 2021 is there, and then the domain 1 score from 2019 is next. Didn't want to bring all the approaches, meets, and masters over. That kind of get to be a lot and hard to read. So, however, that last column is still that difference, 2021 minus my 2019 domain 1. And so what we see here is that 3rd through 8th grade, our reading tests, they all had a decrease. And however, our high school, our English 1, our English 2 tests didn't follow that same trend. They had an increase, just a slight uptick there. So now for math, same chart, different information though. So by grade, our subject is now math, and we see that we do have some big drops in math from 2019 and just kind of across the grade levels. In science, 5th, 8th, and then biology drops across the board. Social studies, our 8th grade, and then our US history test decreases. Not as strong at the high school level, but at the 8th grade level. And then our writing scores dropped in 4th and 7th grade. So kind of seeing decreases across all those subject areas, and each grade, consistent decreases in reading, with the exception of English 1 and English 2, and then consistent decreases in math, science, social studies, and writing. And the decline is district-wide. It's not like there was some specific set of campuses or grade levels that was bringing it down. And so when we look at, okay, that's a scary thing, right? It's very alarming. However, when we look at what the state of Texas has done, we're kind of seeing that same trend, where the biggest decrease is in math, and then smallest decrease in reading, but a decrease nonetheless. And what we notice for ourselves is that while we're consistent, ours are larger values, ours are larger drops. We typically, though, do kind of that 2B relative performance approach, and we like to compare ourselves to districts that are like us. We have a method where we take plus or minus 10% of our SES, and then we look at where do we compare to that group. And that district comparison data will be available in late August. So then what does that mean what does this mean for accountability? Well, we know that in 2020 we were not rated due to COVID, and then in 2021 we have that similar rating. So not rated due to COVID. TEA's guidance is, please don't do any internal calculations. Like there's an impact of COVID learning loss that the scaling and this system don't have cut points designed to address. There was not a pandemic when they created those values. They also don't have an appropriate way to do two-year growth measure. They tried. There was an attempt. However, just because you have the two-year growth doesn't mean that it applies the same way to those cut points. And so the guidance was, look, we're removing the scaling tool from the TEA website. We want to discourage campuses and districts from trying to figure out their calculation from their rating. We told you you're not rated. Please leave it at that. And then they encourage that the estimator be used for planning purposes going forward. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to look forward. So we have our 2021 STAAR results. And just because we don't have a 2021 calculation or rating doesn't mean that we're not going to have a 2022 calculation or rating. So let's look at that. Where are some areas of opportunity? And so the domains that stand out are 2A, that growth piece, specifically the academic growth in reading and math, and then that closing the gaps. So I'm going to also visit with you guys just a few factors on domain 3. So, but let's go with domain 2A first. So I think that growth is key for our students in the past. In 2018, our district growth was 70%. With no COVID and no learning loss, 70%, our raw score was scaled to an 80. And then in 2019, 69% growth for the district, and that scaled to a 79. That was with quite a few students at the approaches, meets, and masters level. Well, we just looked at our STAAR results. Probably not going to have as many students in that meets and masters category, okay? But what that means is I have an opportunity to move my students forward and to grow them, okay? STAAR 2021 happened. I don't know, there's a lot of factors that go into how serious was it taken. It wasn't high stakes because there was a possibility that it wouldn't be rated. No way to really measure that. But where it's at for the prior year, that gives us opportunity to grow in 2022. Let's catch our students back up. And Dr. Wurtz and Dr. Brown are going to visit more about that. I'm going to stick with the math here. So at an elementary school, a raw score of an 82, which is kind of 82% growth, that's going to scale to a 90. Junior high and high school, 80% growth is going to scale to a 90. And then at the district, 76 scales to a 90. It would be really really great, and for my world, I'm always thinking about accountability, it would be great to pull a 90 in for that 70% that we know is going to go into our calculation. And I think that if we do, 70 and 69% in years past when we're not dealing with a pandemic, I think that growing our students, I feel like we can do 76% growth, if not more. So that would be the goal, something to look forward to. Now, domain 3, we're kind of also dealing with some decrease factors that were out of our control. So there's this removal of the armed forces until the DoD will give TEA a list of the students that are going in to the armed forces. So because the whole intent to enlist thing got strange, they just said, okay, we're going to remove it for now. So that's going to cause a decrease. There's also the removal of a half credit for any CTE courses that students were taking. So took that away as well. Now, the targets didn't change, but these opportunities to get to the target were taken away. And then enter COVID, you have a lack of opportunity and requirement even to take college entrance exams like ACT and SAT and TSI. And so all of those things, they're going to cause a decrease in our CCMR percentage. But there is hope. And so kind of always looking towards, okay, then this is where we're at, and so what do we do about it? So some increase factors. House Bill 773 said, okay, we're gonna have an addition of this CTE coherence sequence. Now, ideally, it will be in place for the class of 2021. That's still not set in stone. And there's also nothing set in stone yet about whether it's gonna be a half point or a full point that we're aware of. And so we've kind of run some calculations for, okay, well, if it was the class of 2020, we know their CCMR rate. If we took the CTE coherent sequence course takers that didn't have a point anywhere else and gave them a half point, well, what would happen? Well, our CCMR would jump to a 55%. And then the next scenario, well, what if those kids were actually given a full point? We want to be optimistic. Not too sure they're going to give them a full point, but if they were to give those kids a full point, the ones that didn't have a point elsewhere, that would improve our rate up to 63. Now, that was the class of 2020. So for the class of 2021, with some of the other challenges, there's no way to say, oh, so that same thing is going to happen with the class of 2021. So don't want to say that, but just kind of, it seems like, okay, that could be an area where we'll have an increase. The other area is in that federal graduation rate. I mentioned that I would come back around to that. And so for federal graduation rate, used to just be, hey, 90%, and you have to do better than you did the year before. You noticed on that target sheet that those 90% were just across the board for every subgroup. Well, and we hit 2 of 9 of those targets. But recently, TEA has said, well, okay, let me add in something here. How about this? We want you all to reach 94. We want that to be your goal. 94 and improve over the baseline from the class of 2015. If you don't do that, well, then at least hit 90% to get a yes and improve from what you did in the prior year by 0.1% to get a yes. But if you don't do that, there is this third option, which is, okay, are you on track to hit that 94%? And then there's a complicated formula to determine that. So applying that, to 2019, we would have hit 6 of the 9 targets, and then 2020, we would have hit 8 of the 9 targets. So that seems like an area where, once we apply that new formula, it's just an area of opportunity for us moving forward for that 2022 accountability. Now, that's all the information related to the accountability and the STAAR results. Did we have questions before I turn it over to Dr. Wurtz?
So we're ready to take questions on this portion, President Macy. That's how you'd like to proceed or continue on?
Do we currently have any questions from trustees? Mr. Chapa.
Thank you, President Mays. Dr. Lopez, this is a lot of information, and some of it is review on A through F, and a lot of it is new information for folks who haven't dived into this before. And I hope the takeaway that anybody who's gone through this for the first time gets is that the A through F, that letter that comes out is not nearly as simple as the state has tried to make it look. And I think no better example although there's many that would be just as valuable maybe. You gave the example of we could technically, it's not a matter of just passing the STAAR. You could have, in theory, 100% of your kids pass the STAAR, and you could still end up with a low or failing grade. You know, so it's not as simple as folks would like to make it. But I think the sort of overarching question that I have from all of this, and you mentioned that you're the math person, given that this year was so off, we know that we, across the board, had decreases, and that was true for most districts in the state. What is your sense as a statistician of what we should make of that? Was this year so far off that it's really not statistically valid? And if you give a standardized test, even a really off year, you're going to normalize it. And, you know, some people are going to do worse than others, right? That's just what happens when you give a standardized test. But how, I guess my question is, how valuable, how valid are these results? Do they really indicate that we came out worse from this situation than other districts in the state? Or is it still too early to tell? Or is it a situation we're trying to make the best of this data and we know what the data says, but we don't really know what it tells us to do or where we are, and we really need another year back to quote unquote normal to be able to accurately look back and see how this affected us?
So I certainly wouldn't, I feel like TEA's guidance to not rate based on this was the right move. There's so many factors that they're still trying to figure out how to calculate learning loss. Then you also bring into how do you measure whether a student really tried their best on that test because they knew, well, I don't really have to. I don't even have to go take this test.
Right.
My mom said I can stay home. You know, there's all those other
students, if they wanted to stay home on STAAR test day, they could. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And so we do know participation rate, but we don't know what the non-participants would have done had they come. Maybe they would have showed up and tried their best and performed well, or maybe they would have showed up and kind of blew it off. And okay, I have to go through these motions. So there's just things that we can't measure. So because of that, I think that the most important piece would be this is a data point from one point in time, and we're not going to rate ourselves on it. The cut points designed with prior year data that doesn't correspond to this because, again, that was created with years of non-pandemic data, and so we don't have an appropriate system in order to use this to make a calculation. So what we can do is take the data from the students and use that to set goals for 2022 and then to progress monitor, are we getting there? I don't know if a student tried 100%. You know, I certainly just don't know that based on their test result. But what I do know is it's something that we can use to track how they're doing going forward. And, well, I don't know if I want to say hopefully, but knowing that there's most likely going to be a 2022 accountability might be taken more seriously. And then there's all these other things going on that impacted their maybe psychological mindset when they were taking the test. And so we would hope that returning to normalcy, using this to set goals, and then progress monitoring along the way is the best way, and hopefully the way most districts will use it. We haven't compared ourselves to other districts yet. I mean, we have some summary report data, but that's different than when you look at the system and those that would have been included. And so once that data is available, yes, we can do some comparative percentile ranks.
And even then, do you think it's a situation where we're truly looking at comparable districts, or do you think it's almost impossible to remove each district's individualized situation from a cross-district analysis, right? So we could look at a district that, for example, has similar demographics to us, but maybe took a different policy approach to handling COVID.
Absolutely, yeah. There's so many factors that while we can do what we've done when we do that percentile rank with our comparison groups, there's just things that we can't include in the model to get us to that point.
Right, because I mean, even similarly situated districts had differential rates of students who opted to come in person or take virtual learning. So I think that's going to be hard to untangle. So I don't want to push you out of your comfort zone of math and statistics too much, and because you're not Ms. Foster and you don't deal with communications, but as a policymaker, you know, we're already getting the question, and we are going to get it more as this data comes out and people do things like look at the decreases that we have had across the board relative to the rest of the state. And there's so many issues with comparing us to the, you know, districts statewide and looking at statewide averages when there's 1,100 school districts in Texas, and you know, we're one of the biggest, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them that have very few students, and we're maybe not nearly as impacted as by COVID as we were. But what would you suggest that when we get those difficult questions of, well, you know, it sure looks to me like we've got some statistics here that say, well, yeah, it was a rough year, but it was a rough year for everybody, and you did a lot worse than the rest of the state. What is a sort of concise, simple explanation that we can provide to the public to help explain why those numbers aren't the end-all be-all, or why they might not be as valuable as they were in prior years?
I'd say there's just too many factors that we can't measure and include in a fair comparison, and also those factors that can't be used in accountability. And so while it may appear that we don't 100% know yet, while it might appear that if we do worse than our comparison districts, there's no way to know if that's a legit comparison.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chapa. Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, President Mays, and thank you, Dr. Lopez, for doing the deep dive. And it's just proven yet again that, you know, even though we can't reduce a student to a single number on from a single test given on one day in April, TAs tried really hard to create 3 different domains using a very complex formula, and this pandemic broke that formula. As much effort as they put into it, the pandemic broke it. And to answer Mr. Chapa's question is, you know, it's almost impossible if someone wants to compare us to Fort Worth. When you look at our economically disadvantaged peers, you know, and try to rank them, it doesn't look good, but it's still meaningless. There was over 1 million students that did not take this test. And it varied, as Mr. Chapa said, from district to district. So what we do know, you know, there's very few things that we can discern from this test, but what we do know is that those districts that had a higher percentage of remote learners, virtual learners, did a lot worse. And our numbers prove that if you look at the individual scores. Students that before that were economically disadvantaged performed much worse. Districts that are high perform worse than wealthy districts. That gap has gotten wider across the state. Students of color performed worse. That has gotten even wider because of the results of the pandemic. And so I think the bottom line is, all these domains that are reliant, like domain 2 and 3, that compare us with prior years are going to be impossible. You've stated that over and over tonight about how TAs tried in vain. And I think we as a board need to back up and away from this complexity and look at the fact that the learning loss, if you look at our scores for 3rd grade reading, 4th grade math, dropped considerably. We can't compare ourselves to Dallas and Fort Worth or any other district across, or even our ECHO-DIS peers, because there's too many complex factors that go into it. We have to look at them in isolation. TEA said itself and warned us that we cannot look at this data in isolation. We need other data points like our screener data and other data points to accurately gauge student loss. And as you said, they've repeatedly sent out the message that we can't use it for comparison data. It's flawed data because of the conditions it was given in. I would argue it was a flawed test to begin with, even before that. But so I think, and I'm looking forward to us calibrating in a workshop in the future, because there are a few things that we can discern from this data going forward. We need to focus on those, but really, you know, and I'd love to do root cause analysis on, if you look at our data, why were we kind of in the bottom half of our ECHO-DIS peers? We can't say that we were or we weren't because of the data. We need to avoid those kind of things and look and say, look, these are the subgroups that appear to be affected the most by COVID loss. We need to wrap our strategies around those that appear most affected by the learning loss and move forward and look forward, because again, this data is almost meaningless. So.
I think if you take the comparison group, which is typically about 400 of the 1,200, and you then say, well, let me include that factor of the participation rate, it would diminish that group down. And then you say, well, let me take into consideration the percentage of learning environment. How many districts were like us in that? It would reduce that even more. So our comparison group, once we actually did try to add in all those other factors, would become so small that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Mrs. McMurrah?
Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for all the math, all the things math. I differ slightly with some of what's been said. STAAR fan or not, there is a lot we can glean from this data, and it's our responsibility to do so. I do want to preface that, you know, with that in mind, principals and teachers cannot be fairly held accountable for student achievement if they do not have significant control over their work. And all things COVID, you know, our version of the hybrid learning model last year, these are all going to be part of the conversation, I'm hopeful, in our workshop, so we can glean, okay, what were the controllables and what were the uncontrollables? We can control the controllables. And, you know, I know that campus staff, teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, they have already poured over their data just like they do every year. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, forever. They drill down to the individual student. And it's not because STAAR is the end-all be-all, it's because they care. We have that as our state assessment, and we need to look at that. And as Mr. Wilbanks mentioned, many other pieces. But I do think there's a lot that we can glean from the data. So I really do appreciate my colleagues agreeing to do a workshop. I think that that's going to be great, not just for STAAR purposes, but so we can, you know, help that guide our strategic plan. That revision is coming up, and see how we can best support our campuses moving forward at a district level, at a district-wide level. Also, I do want to throw something out there. I've been thinking a lot about the phrase learning loss. And we hear it on the news, we see it on social media, we talk about it as educators, as board trustees. But I really would love for us to consider changing our phrase from learning loss to unfinished learning, because you can't lose something you didn't have in the first place. And, you know, I think that our children are just as bright, just as capable. Their potential, I would argue, might be kicked up a notch, because look at how resilient they've become. And so unfinished learning, to me, better matches the context of where we are. And I think that if we can use that, you know, phrase for our educators watching, I think that brings a little bit of the hope back. Because learning loss just has that connotation, you know. And so that's something that I would like for us to consider. But again, this is very helpful. I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of the presentation, and thanks again for all your hard work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. McMurrow. Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, Ms. Mays. I forgot I had a question about CCMR, but thank you for the comments from my colleague, Ms. McMurrow. I really value her insight as a teacher in the classroom and now as an instructional coach. And I do want to reiterate that I want to acknowledge all the hard effort that went into this past year that our teachers put in. And these scores, let it be clear, these scores are no way indicative of the great work that they did every single day in the classroom for our students, just to get our students to survive this last year. And going forward, I know, look, these aren't acceptable scores to me. You're right, Ms. McMurrow. We can glean that, hey, this is not where we want to be, and it does look like the learning loss was more significant. We were impacted more, but the good news is we have the money. We have a great team out here, as Dr. Wurtz, and we have a great statistician, it appears, that it really knows the accountability system. We have a great team, and we have great teachers who I know are going to finish that unfinished business and get those students back where they need to be. And I have a feeling that we're going to see a big bounce because I know the teachers are ready to go. I'm sorry we're not having convocation, but it's going to be a great year. There is heavy lifting, but these scores, let me say it again, these scores are not indicative of the quality work and the effort of our teachers going above and beyond last year. In fact, it's almost a disservice that these were published because they have no correlation to the work that went in to each and every classroom across this district.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Mrs. Fowler?
Thank you, President Mays. I hope that teachers will be allowed to slow down and let students master material before moving on. And as a teacher, they're kind of forced, they got to get through the book. You got to get through all these concepts. And I think that hasn't worked in the past, and it surely hasn't worked during COVID. So I hope that teachers will be allowed to slow down and not worry about getting through the whole book, but rather letting the students master material before they move on to a new concept. So that worries me. The second thing I'm worried about as a college teacher, we look at those scores, the SATs, the TSI, to determine placement in courses. My worry is that students are not going to place well on those exams, and then we'll have to take the developmental or the foundation courses. Having taught both levels, the foundation courses and the on-level, students who sometimes have to go through those foundation level courses end up really being better students on the level courses because they've had that time to improve. So that's not always a bad thing, and I've told my students that. Don't feel bad about being in this foundation course or this developmental course because you're going to get a lot more information and in the end be a better student when you're in the 1301 and 1302 English classes. I teach English. But I just don't want those students to get where they feel like that they've lost ground and that they're having to take those developmental courses. And sometimes if students take too long getting through those developmental courses, they end up quitting. Yeah. And that's a big problem that we've had at TCC is they just get burned out. They think they can't get past it. But that's my fear is that these students have lost some ground, of course, but I'm just afraid that they're going to be placed into the developmental and foundation courses, and that can slow down their college academics. So that'll be something I think it'll be interesting to watch and see the results of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fowler. Mr. Hogg?
I appreciate the comments from my very smart colleagues. They're right on. I just started thinking of something as Ms. Fowler said that. With TEA now allowing any parent to opt to choose for their students to repeat, do we know what those numbers are yet of how many are repeating? And when do we think we'll know those numbers? Do we have any estimate? We ask you to pull out crystal balls all the time. it's amazing what you can do with data, but do we have an idea of how many will take advantage of that?
We don't have an idea at this point, Mr. Hogg, on how many, because students are registering and it just kind of moves you to the next grade level, but they know they have a choice. And so as they come to school, I think we'll have a better picture, but I couldn't tell you today that it's a big volume or anything like that.
And with that, are we making any recommendations with that? I mean, I know, listen, and Dr. Wurtz has taught me a lot about this because there are some challenges when a student repeats, right? Like there's been discussion tonight over anxiety, social, emotional, and those things have to be taken into account versus catching them up at the same time. And so I think those numbers, because those can be numbers that affect how we're going forward on this and get to, I can't remember what the new term is, not learning loss, but get us to where we need to be.
Right. Yeah, I would just add a little bit of context to that, is that these decisions of holding somebody back or a parent deciding that to repeat a grade level or start a different grade level is really a case by case. And we should really, I think it gets lost in the news and media and others because it's just, here's an option. But it's really a mindful case by case that works in partnership with the school. The people that know, the educators that know, the parents that know also the performance of students to make a good decision. And that's where I hope this flexibility really goes to a better partnership to make that decision versus you have the choice now, so you just decide. Because the educators have a lot of voice in that and have a lot of knowledge of that. And they have a lot of recommendations. And in some cases, Mr. Hogg, it is appropriate, and in other cases, it's not. And we know that. Yeah, it causes bigger issues.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. I see no other questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. Appreciate the presentation.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Dr. Wurtz.
See you. So you just got, I would call, the quick version of the accountability system, which is a very, very long manual done very expertly by Dr. Lopez. And I'm going to share with you now some of our instructional response to this data. I kind of feel like I'm trying to give you a perspective of what we're working on and trying to squeeze it into a small presentation, which I know you've seen the slides is not that small. You're right. But I do think it's small and representative of the actual work that's taking place. So my goal tonight is actually to narrow down to some of the big strategies we're doing and specifically how we're measuring the impact of those strategies as we move along. And then as we go through the year, we'll be able to share more information as we kind of go through the data. But the first thing we did is we started with the needs assessment, and we talk a lot in this meeting about a needs assessment and why we do it and specifically what we're looking for. And the way we're kind of phrasing it with our staff for everybody to think about is you kind of think of a needs assessment similarly to the way a doctor would approach your care when you go to the doctor's office, try to diagnose specifically what your problem is and to prescribe the right medication to help you. Well, learning is no different. And there are a lot of actual mitigating factors that we know have impacted unfinished learning that's actually taken place in our students' learning trajectories. We know that some of it is simple things like changes in their routine. All of us who have kids at home know that even just shaking up the routine, even in small points, can actually impact a child. There's been breaks in the continuity of their health care. There have been significant life events that students have missed, which have actually impacted their ability to, or their learning. Some families have actually experienced loss in their own security, in their safety. We know that there are some families who have found themselves in scenarios where they can't even find money to pay their rent. We've had social isolation and distancing going on all across our state or in the country, which has impacted us emotionally. And then finally, there have been disruptions in learning. Sometimes the disruptions are as simple as the fact that we had to change the learning environment for students. Even if we are continuing to give them training and learning, the fact that many of them went to an online platform was disruptive, not only to staff but also to students. So all these things were kind of taken into account. And this information actually comes out of a study that was published by Integris Health this year. When we went through our root cause analysis, the very first thing we did is we started thinking about what were the main pillars that we were going to be focusing on. And I had mentioned those and introduced those earlier when we talked about ESSER. We were looking at acceleration, equity, we looked at social emotional learning, and specifically how we were going to progress monitor. And what we did is we asked ourselves basically these 5 questions. If we were doing social emotional learning excellently, or if progress monitoring was happening in an excellent way, what would success look like? So we asked ourselves, what would success look like? What kinds of things would we need to address the needs of all of our subgroups in each of these 4 categories? Are there things in the system that we need to reimagine or do differently? How are all the stakeholders impacted? We asked ourselves all these questions just as a starting point in terms of our root cause analysis, which is this idea of like, if you get to the end point, you're actually doing well, what does it even look like? So you can start to assess what that gap is. We also started thinking about what we believe are our instructional targets. So the way I kind of describe this to staff is I call these like our vitals that you would use when you go to the doctor's office. What are the big rocks that if you pay attention to would tell you if something's off in a system? So I'll give you a real simple example like 3rd grade reading. If your 3rd grade reading scores are struggling, you know you have a problem in primary grades around reading. So you start to dig in deeper to understand where that could be. Or it could be in the 3rd grade instruction and what part of the 3rd grade instruction is actually causing those outcomes. Well, this is an example of instructional targets that we're going to be monitoring, what I call vital signs at the system level. And they are STAAR scores primarily, with the exception of kindergarten readiness and CCMR, which technically is part of STAAR, but it's not a STAAR score. These are STAAR scores. This does not mean that these scores are the only thing that we would pay attention to. It's the endpoint. And I do think that's an important point to reinforce is this is one test given on one day in a 4-hour time period. Does not necessarily represent what a child totally knows, and sometimes there are lots of things that impact the way a student actually performs on that day. The other thing that's important to note about this school year versus previous school years is some kids in like 5th and 8th grade had multiple testing opportunities that are reflected in those scores, and this year SSI was out the door. So these are just instructional targets, but as we work with campuses, the things that we look at more deeply are, okay, as we move towards 3rd grade, what are the screener information telling us? How are kids actually moving towards this trajectory so we can monitor progress, kind of like you would go to the doctor every month and have your vitals taken? What are some smaller finite measures that we can monitor? And we'll share those things with you. These targets will be published and shared with you, and we represent it in a kind of a table that looks like this, and you're familiar with this table because this was published for House Bill 3. We did a few things that are different in terms of the way they're represented. Each campus and the district as a whole will receive a table that looks like this for every subject area for which they are responsible. So if you go back to the last slide, if I'm an elementary school, I'm going to get a table for 3rd grade reading, I'm going to get a table for 3rd grade math, and I'm going to get a table for kindergarten readiness. If I'm high school, it's going to be different. At the system level, we'll have it for all of them, and it will show you the specific goals for each of the subgroups that we're responsible for. And the reason we want to do that is we want to make sure that all students are having the opportunity to learn and grow at the right pace. The other thing that's important to note about in this slide is that the campus individual tables were statistically created so that they add up to what the district is, and everyone has an understanding about what their portion of the pie is. The important thing to note about the tables is there were some adjustments. They are modeled, like I mentioned, to support equity. So if you're a school that has high levels of low socioeconomic students, your impact or race to the finish line, so to speak, may be different each year as opposed to a school that's already achieving at 90%. The other thing is we did adjust the targets to the 2021 baseline. So the initial House Bill 3 targets that you saw were based on a 5-year trajectory based on 2019 results. But as you can see, we are starting from a completely different place, and to try to mimic those or continue to mirror those goals as we're moving is not realistic and will set the system up for failure. So we have readjusted our baseline to 2021. And then we did some thinking, which of those goals, if we wanted to try to get back up to the 2019 baseline point, we know, like, for example, math, we regressed 20 points. If I want to move it back up to at least the 2019, how long should that take us to get there? Well, some of our targets, we think we can get there in 3 years. Some of our targets we think are actually going to take 5. So what you'll see when we publish these, and we'll share, of course, drafts with Dr. Cavazos to share with you in advance before we publish them, you're going to see targets of some of these targets we've actually accelerated to a 3-year time frame. Some of them we're actually recommending to a 5-year time frame, just so that we can we can be realistic in terms of our approach and expectation on staff. The other thing as part of our root cause analysis that we dug into is we started looking at just system-wide screener data. What were the big kind of problems that we typically are seeing in terms of reading around our kids, and how do we actually compare some of these things to what we believe are actual practices in the classroom around literacy instruction and mathematics. And so I just want to walk you briefly through kind of the overarching steps we took. And I do want to emphasize the danger in making all the decisions on STAAR. I actually do agree with you, Ms. McMurrow, that there's valuable information we can glean from a STAAR score, but we can't necessarily assume that the STAAR score represents all the kids have to learn because of the way that the STAAR score is designed. The tests measure specific standards, not all of which are actually, it doesn't even cover even a fraction of all the things that are actually taught in the classroom that year. And some standards are actually only tested with a single question. And that doesn't necessarily tell a teacher what they know or don't know. So if I was a teacher and I was to look at my STAAR score from a student and say, well, gosh, they missed 14, and 14 was the only question that was used to test 3.7B, and then I started pouring all this effort into 3.7B, I might be actually wasting my time. They may actually know it. It just was the way the question was designed. So what we did is we looked at this at the system level and we said, okay, where's the cut point? And what does the actual numbers say? Meaning like which actual assessment questions represented which standards? Meaning what were we assessing in the first place? So we looked at each of those standards and then we said, what was the actual performance level descriptor for that standard? So if the standard was 3.7B, we actually went to 3.7. We went to the actual performance level descriptors that TA published to say what kids should be doing if they master these specific standards on the test. Because what we wanted to know was which ones were actually weak and what was the performance level supposed to look like had they mastered it. So from that place, we went over to the vertical alignment documents that are published by TEA, and we dug into where those problems were and how they were perpetuated across the system. So for example, if I knew there was a challenge in Algebra 1, then we said, okay, well, I'm struggling in Algebra 1 with this. Is it possible that there are also implications in how that was taught, that the link to it, how it was taught in 8th grade and 7th grade and 5th grade, 6th grade, all the way down. So on this slide, what you can see is us as a system moving from Algebra 1 all the way down to grade 1, looking at trying to understand where the problem may lie when it comes to kids mastering this subject in algebra. So, and the idea is to do exactly kind of what you all have been talking about earlier, is figure out where the gaps are so you can fill those in as they're moving so they can be successful in the next course. I have to reemphasize this idea of root cause analysis, because we speak to it very prescriptively sometimes, like we can do what a doctor does, which is, really use science to understand that you have a specific ailment and apply a very specific prescription. And that may be true in like primary grades, for example. Like I can use screener data to understand that you have a problem with phonemic awareness and I can apply a specific prescription. But generally speaking, when you're not talking at the student level, you're talking at the system level, it becomes more of a social science. You have to ideate about where your challenges are. I can't tell you specifically why Stephen's not learning in the classroom. There are 51 things that could be impacting my learning in the classroom, some of which may have nothing to do with the teacher or the school at all. It may be completely at home. So as we kind of went through our root cause analysis, we started thinking about, are there any physical causes that could be causing these gaps to occur? Are there actually challenges in the way that we as human beings or teachers or staff are actually implementing best practice in the classroom? And are there organizational or system challenges that we could actually improve to make those happen? And we ideated around those things using the fishbone analysis, which I've referred to in the past. And what we did is we looked at specific systems within in the district. We looked at instruction, we looked at curriculum, we looked at equity, we looked at assessment data, we looked at professional learning and coaching, school culture, and as a team, we started ideating what were the causes, were there any implications around these things that could actually impact this one challenge? And we started thinking about how we could actually work towards solving those problems. And we leveraged, to your point, Ms. McMurrow, we leveraged this document, which is called Addressing Unfinished Learning After COVID-19 School Closure. This was actually published by the Council of Great City Schools. It's a really good white paper with very solid principles. And we leveraged these guiding principles to help us in our thinking in terms of accelerating learning. One was stick to grade level content. You can't stop teaching 5th grade and go back and just teach 4th grade material because they won't be ready for 6th grade. So we had to figure out how to keep them moving in 5th grade and fill in the gaps. Focus on the depth of instruction and not the pace. You kind of mentioned that earlier, Ms. Fowler. We want to give teachers the flexibility to slow down if they need to. However, we also know that the state says when the May Day shows up and you have to take the STAAR, you have to have been through the curriculum. So how do you find that sweet spot of how fast or slow you go? Prioritizing specific learning content, which I'm going to talk to tonight, how we've kind of elevated that for teachers so there's no guesswork around it. How to make sure we're including every learner, and then how do we identify learning gaps by using instruction, avoiding just misusing one data point, which Dr. Lopez talked about in this case with STAAR. The other thing we've had to think about was how do we address all of this in terms of the context of a budget? We know we have resources and materials, but we also know that they're not infinite. So we started thinking about how the things we can do would kind of fall in line with these basically 6 principles, which I won't go and read all of them, but in essence, do they address short-term and long-term goals? Is there equity across the system? Are we going to be able to measure the impact those things are having? These are some of the main principles we thought about as we started selecting strategies. So we have established a protocol, which is going to sound very much like if you go to the doctor. And it's because when you're working with kids and you're trying to figure out what the problem is, that's the key. Address the diagnosis and then apply the prescription. If you get the diagnosis wrong, you're just spinning your wheels. So the first thing we want to do is recognize the symptoms and ask ourselves, is there observable evidence in the classroom or the way the child is learning that is telling us that there's in fact a learning challenge? And if that's the case, let's diagnose the issue. Really try to look at the outcomes. It could be screener data, it could be STAAR data, it could be formative assessments, pre and post assessments that teachers do for units of study to help understand where the gap is and why we think that gap's occurring. Once we know there's a gap, then the important thing is to apply what we call the prescription. And not just apply the prescription, but actually measure that it's actually being done well. One of the things I said in a team meeting today, and I've used this example earlier, is if I'm a student and I struggle with phonemic awareness, for example, and the only thing I'm trying to do as a teacher to solve it is guided reading, I'm never going to solve that problem because guided reading is not the primary solution to a phonemic awareness problem. So what we have to figure out is if there's a specific strategy or a specific intervention that you want to apply to a specific diagnosis, you have to measure that that intervention is being done consistently, it's being done with fidelity, and to the level of dosage that is expected. And then finally, the last one is to monitor progress, meaning if I apply these interventions, is the outcome with students actually being impacted or not? Because if I'm doing these things as designed and this isn't going up, then I have to change my prescription. It's kind of like we go to the doctor, right? So what is our prescriptive portfolio in Arlington? And while there are several things in the district that we'll continue to do, like PBIS and things like that, we're really elevating 2 very specific strategies, which we know are research-based and that there is actual effect sizes attached to these. There are 4 specific best practices. We have 12 in the district. We're focusing on 4 specifically to start off with. One is standards alignment, assessment, formative feedback, small group instruction, differentiation and scaffolding, and we're going to focus on making sure that every reading and math teacher across the system receives coaching in order to master the use and implementation of these best practices. And the way I kind of think of this, if you want to kind of like dive into like an instructional kind of strategy, this is a thinking map. It's called a bridge map. It's basically used to show you how things are related to each other. The way we kind of frame it is the prescription, meaning what we're actually going to try to do is apply best practices in coaching. And the way we're going to measure the vitals is we're going to track specifically how many teachers are actually receiving coaching, which coaches are coaching them, are they making progress in their implementation of those practices, do they need additional support, and then also what's the relationship between the teachers that are mastering these best practices and the outcomes their kids are having. Is there a relationship? We're looking for a positive one. And the goal around all of this is to monitor and support, and there are several systems that we're going to put in place to do that, which I'll talk about tonight. So the first thing I want to mention is I just want to dive a little bit deeper into what these 4 best practices are and how we plan on implementing them in our system. And there's a quote by Marcus Speck that says, "Students of the future will demand the learning support that is appropriate for their situation or context, nothing more, nothing less." In other words, our students are learning today in a context that's different than the way you and I learned when we were in school, and they deserve to be taught in a way that's going to prepare them for their future. The other thing that we've known is that active learning is better than passive learning. Kids don't want to go to school and passively learn. They want to be deeply engaged and actively learn. So there's a quote here by Kurt Lewin that says, learning is more effective when it's active rather than passive in process. So how does this all relate to these best practices? Well, this is a simple graph or a table that you've seen probably before that I've shared that shows you where the research is linked, connected to these specific best practices. And if you're familiar with really big researchers in the field of education, you're going to see the names like Hattie and Marzano and Knight. You're going to see McRell and all these other people and organizations. And there was a meta-analysis conducted that really pulled together all this research to identify what are the main practices that we know actually have an effect size in the classroom. And the other thing you're going to notice on here is that they are all aligned also to T-tests. So if a teacher who's being appraised by their principal is working on a specific goal, and for example, on this slide, if their goal was 1.1, that's directly aligned to any goals that they would be working on if they're mastering assessment and formative feedback. So what you're going to see marked in the gold boxes are actually the 4 that we're going to focus on this year. And you can see the research columns that actually support them, and specifically where in T-tests that they're being re-emphasized. The important thing to know about T-tests is T-test was actually constructed by teachers for teachers with TEA. It's also based on research. So nothing that these best practices are going to help facilitate with teachers is actually going to take them in a different direction than the way the state already expects. So how does this actually look in practice? So I wanted to share a slide that we actually shared with principals and staff, actually as early as today even, about how this would work in terms of best practice if I was a teacher. So our units in our district, in our curriculum, are divided into units and bundles. What you'll see here in red is something very common. You're going to see leveled, 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 leveled. And the reality is these 4 best practices, if done as designed, will allow a teacher the opportunity to understand and design instruction based upon where kids actually are and give them an individualized pathway to mastery. And so what this will, as they set goals around these 4 best practices, it's going to reinforce and we'll be coaching them and teaching them how to actually build assessments, a leveled pre-assessment, so that if I was to give that assessment to all of you, I would be able to take the data from that and understand specifically where each of you are, and then align that to a pathway that's individualized for you, so you're not all just doing the same thing per se. So we talk about leveled pre-assessments, leveled formative assessments, so I can see how you're going. So if Miss Mays is in a different place than I am, and she's more advanced and I'm a little farther behind, then my actual formative assessment along the way is going to check where I am compared to where I started, and that one will check where she's at. Same thing with during the bundle. There's individualized learning, like I was talking about. Small group instruction is actually leveled for students. So are the assessments they're taking. So you can just see in this very simple kind of chart that the implementation of best practice is designed to do that, accelerate learning through leveling. Now that's very different than ability grouping. It's just basically customizing your path. So this is what it would basically look like. This is a rubric for one of the best practices, differentiation and scaffolding. I highlighted this one because this is kind of the one I think that we often misinterpret in education. We say differentiation. If you go into a classroom, there's a bunch of centers going on that they're differentiating for kids, and there might be some level of differentiation, but that's not the differentiation we're talking about. What we're talking about is what I just described. So what this rubric does is it allows the coaching and the support of the teacher as he or she is being developed around the best practice to be focused around a similar outcome. So it doesn't matter what school you're at, it doesn't matter which coach you're working with, we're going to customize our support for you, but the end point of mastery of that best practice is the same. So if I'm a teacher and I'm starting at a level 1, for example, and you can see it's broken up into 2 different strands, one's around resources and one's around individualized learning, I might choose a goal that's focused on getting to level 2 around the individualized learning, and then I'm going to set my target with my coach about how I'm going to move closer to that. Does it mean I'm going to do all the things in level 2 all about once? No, there are multiple growth indicators that help me go little at a time, and when I reach enough growth indicators, then I'll eventually badge because I will be proficient in using this. Our goal is for all of our math and reading teachers over the next 3 years to badge in all 4 of these, and we're going to track how we do it. The other thing that we're doing is trying to take the guesswork out of which rocks to lift up in the curriculum in terms of prioritized standards, because they're not all created equal, and there are some really important concepts that if are not learned in the prerequisite course will prevent students from being successful in the next one. So how do we do that? Well, this is just a quick, I guess, a tree graph that will show you kind of where the curriculum is kind of falling. We have the text resource system, which is really around grades 3 through 12, and then we use our own curriculum for K through 2. And the primary reason we've chosen to do that is because we leverage social studies and literacy. We put those two things together when we're teaching primary grades, and the text resource system doesn't provide for that, so we opted to keep our own. But you'll see that in both categories that there is specific documents and resources that are found on Curriculum Central, and there are specific documents and resources that are found on text resources, and then there are some global ones that are connected more to the specific subgroups that we're serving. This just breaks that down for you by content area, so you can see what kinds of courses in high school and secondary you would actually find in the text resource system. We also have for each of these companion documents and learning progressions for the teachers to access for these courses in Curriculum Central. So while the main curriculum comes from text resource system, there are companion documents and learning progressions for teachers in this content area. And then these are the courses that are not available in the text resource system that we do offer here. You're going to notice that the components in our system are the same ones in the other one, which is we still have IFDs, we still have YAGs, scopes and sequences. All of those things are available. They're just housed in our own documents for the primary grades. The ELAR that you see in 7th and 8th and 9th and 12th, the breakup is really more about how we're addressing our ELs and our newcomers as they progress through our curriculum. We have 2 different courses that they participate in at different levels, and that's what that's about. So how does this look when you're actually planning for acceleration? Like, what would a teacher actually need to be thinking about, and coaches and supports from the district as they're working through? Well, there are 4 steps that we're talking about, and I kind of just want to take a brief moment to walk you through and show you where the best practices actually land for each one of these steps. So in essence, the idea is if you are implementing the best practices, you're actually going to be doing all of these things. So there's 4 major steps. The first one has 4 steps across it, but basically they are identifying your instructional focus, evaluating and designing your assessments, planning your daily instruction, and then using the data and adjusting the lesson design impact. So you might ask, well, why would I design my assessment and all of this before I start instructions? Because you're trying to figure out what the endpoint's supposed to look like so you can design towards it. So how do you do that? So if you're planning with the best practice in mind, you were thinking about step 1, you would literally go through these 4 steps, and you can see there's A, B, C, and D. How do you prioritize what you're teaching? What knowledge and skills are embedded? What concepts and principles serve my students throughout their lives? All these kinds of questions you ask. And then when you get to step 2, you have to start thinking about how am I going to know when my students are actually arriving there? Well, these 2 things are 2 of the best practices. One of them is aligning to the standard. The other one is assessing our students and providing formative feedback, knowing where they are when you start, how do I know how they're doing along the way, and how do I know when they actually get there. Then we have steps 3 and 4, which basically is the actual instruction. So what strategies am I going to be using to actually teach the concept, and then how do I adjust my instruction along the way based upon how I'm getting feedback from kids in terms of how they're learning. These 2 concepts alone actually cover all 4 of our best practices. So there is learning embedded in each of the 4 best practices that actually cover these 2 steps. So our goal is for teachers to do all 4 of these steps as they plan for instruction. And frankly, if we had everybody in the system doing this routinely, we would be doing really, really good, solid teaching in the classroom. The other thing we wanted to highlight too is that there are resources that we've actually tried to think about. So this slide here talks specifically, it's a document that tells teachers where they can find all the different parts, so they're not trying to search all over text resource system and Curriculum Central. We've actually mapped out each of those steps that I just talked about and highlighted where in the documents they can actually find the resources to do those things, so they're not doing the guesswork for them, they're not having to search for themselves. This is just an example of how to dive into some of those resources for step 2. So in step 2, you're really evaluating and designing your assessment. So the things you want to ask yourself is, I need to create my assessments before I begin instruction, and I need to identify what evidence I'm going to use to know that learning is actually occurring. Well, here in this document, we actually tell teachers where they can find answers to those questions so that they can design an assessment that's actually aligned to the standard. This is just a quick example. Our companion documents have 5 different components, the ones that I'm highlighting tonight. And this companion document is specifically focused on priority standards, like helping teachers understand what's considered the priority content for their course. You're going to see on this document, there's a summative assessment available for teachers to use. We actually articulate what the learning progression is, and so how do kids typically learn these concepts, and what order do they usually go? And the great thing about that is that if students are farther ahead, you can start there. You don't have to waste time on things they've already learned. There are formative assessments, so how do teachers monitor progress along the way? And then we elevate specifically the priority content that they should be focusing on, as well as interventions that are available. And we broke these things down. So if you actually look at this example, this is an example of of one of the priority content standards, and it's articulated in 3 ways. So what the staff has done is they've articulated the actions the students would need to be able to do, what the goal of the student learning actually is, and where the resources are found to actually do that for students. So if you were to look at the instructional focus document, if you were to look at the prioritized content document portion that's embedded into this portion of the support document, you would see that it's articulated very clearly for teachers, so they don't have to try to dig around in terms of their resources to understand how do I even address this need. The other thing that's really important is that our system really leverages the DDI process. Campus principals have all been trained, everyone's pretty proficient in it, and it happens routinely in PLCs. So what we have tried to do is to take the examples that's part of the DDI process with Bambergs and Toya, and embed the thinking and the resources in that framework, so that when people are going to their data meetings and PLCs and they're trying to think about their work, they're not having to go search for things to go through those steps. We've actually placed them there for them to think about. So this is just an example of a pre-assessment exemplar. And ideally, we want teachers to design their exemplars and have a common assessment that they're going to leverage, so that we know where all the students on a grade level are actually going when they learn the concept. They can actually leverage this document to help them in the design of their exemplar, and it's all aligned to the DDI process. Some of the other resources that we're working on this year is our goal is to actually upload exemplar lessons from each of the content areas and grade levels for teachers to leverage, written by teachers, for teachers, and pay our teachers for their work to do that. Our actual target is 10 lessons per grade level per content area, and we will solicit that from our teachers as they're working. It'll go through a vetting process so that we know that it's an exemplar and that they're actually high quality lessons. But right now, teachers are going to Teacher Made Teacher and all these other places to get things. We already have really good skilled teachers here. Why not place them in a place where everyone can have access to it? Some other resources that were actually published a lot earlier but are still available to teachers as they still leverage a blended environment, because we know that we learned a lot from being in this experience, and we know technology is still going to be used. There's a time saver toolkit that's available. There's still resources available to teachers in terms of how to engage in some of the technology that we have. Our guidance around grading towards mastery is still there, and we'll still continue to work on that. And then, of course, we have the Connected Learning Framework, which was designed with our team using information that came from the Center of Transformative Teaching and Learning, which really breaks down general practices, inputs, processes, just to help teachers as they think about taking kids from one point, meaning their whole learning environment, how do you build social emotional learning in your classroom, setting the targets for learning, all the way to the delivery of instruction, assessing learning along the way. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to highlight in terms of resources was the Engagement Hub. And I have to really thank Steve Simpson and his team, who worked really hard on this, which was one of the biggest challenges. You know, especially in kids when they're engaged in a remote, how do you get kids engaged? We really struggled with that last year. Well, we know kids are coming back to school, but they're used to having their own routine, and so we need to re-engage them. So this is an engagement hub. The way it actually works is you actually tap on one of the different fingers, and then different resources come available. So I just highlighted a few of them for you. One, we provided resources and supports around how to encourage engagement with students by embedding checks for understanding and formative assessments in the learning process. We have information and supports on how to make your content interactive, so that students can engage in like choice boards and dialogue cards and different kinds of things, so that they're engaged in the learning process that way. There's information about how do you leverage relationships in the classrooms to facilitate engagement. We've also talked about or shown how do you progress monitor, how do you actually let kids take ownership in their own learning and tracking their own progress so they're naturally engaged in their learning process. And then finally, how do you really think about it through dynamic live instruction? So how do you use signals and visuals and things to cue students to get them to really pay attention and be participative or participatory in their learning process? The third strategy that I want to highlight tonight is coaching, and I'm highlighting this one because this is really, really big. And I would say that Arlington has done a really great job in embedding this practice into our system, more so than any system I've ever actually been able to work for in the past. And I want to just highlight some of the data that comes out of the study. This is done by Joyce and Showers. And basically, they've done research in terms of how do you take learning as an adult and translate it into practice. Because we've all been to trainings and then we go back to our life. And that's not the goal, right? So if you look at the column that's on the far left-hand side, you're going to see a progression. So it's theory and discussion, and then you have theory and discussion plus a demonstration, or you have theory and discussion plus a demonstration plus practice and feedback. Well, you're going to notice that it starts to get a little bit more, you gain more and more knowledge the more deeply you engage in those different practices. When you add coaching, your knowledge base grows significantly, because if you think about it, I'm engaging with you in a coaching process and we're working around the finite, discrete skills that you need, not that a whole group of people need, just like we want kids to do. Well, what we've noticed, or what the studies talk about, is the fact that if you do these training components, even when you get to skill demonstration, you're never going to actually get to the high point of transference until you embed coaching at the bottom. So, for example, if you go to the far right-hand column, this is actual practice in the classroom. You could go to a training where you're learning about theory and discussion. You can go to the training where we're even demonstrating. We could go to the training where you actually do practice and we give you feedback in the training. But that still only usually translates, the research is showing, to about 5% transference into your practice in the classroom. But if I actually coach you and we take you where you are and go little at a time, there's a 95% transference rate. So our thought is, if we know there's research that says these are the 4 best practices that actually will impact learning, how do we support teachers in the development of those things and make sure that it actually turns into practice in the classroom? Well, that's coaching. So as a system, what we've done is we've leveraged 2 coaching models that we've embedded to create what we're calling the Arlington ISD Coaching Feedback Framework. We have the eGrow coaching model, which is the how you do it, basically where you go through all the steps and identify where you are, what your options are, you set your goals, you create evidence, all those things which I'll talk about. And then we also have the 6 steps of effective feedback that come from Bamberg and Centoya that's very it's infused in our system. So what our goal is that as a system, we're all using the same model. So we worked with the Office of School Leadership and the Teaching and Learning Department, and we've combined those 2 things because in essence, they do the same thing. They just use different terminology and different kinds of phrasing. And so what we did is we married those 2 things to create what we call, like I said, the AISD Coaching Feedback and Framework. And this is the framework that all coaches are using in the district. All leaders will be using with their staff. All of us that are coaching will use this. And in essence, what you do is you go through the eGrow process where you really think about where you are, where you want to go, how you can get there, and what evidence you're going to use to say that you actually happen to get there. All of our teachers will receive coaching. So every literacy and math teacher in Arlington ISD over the next 3 years will receive coaching. We will have E2L coaches working with teachers, and they'll have 7 coaching touch points over the course of the year. If you're an active learning cycle teacher, you'll be coached by your actual coach at your campus, and they'll have 5+ coaching cycles during the course of the year. We also have coaching going on for the coaches and the leaders. So principals will receive coaching and coaches will receive coaching on their coaching. And so if you'll see on the far left-hand side, you'll see an audience. I won't go through it in all the detail because you can read, but basically you can see campus coaches, experienced coaches, new coaches, and principals will all receive coaching by district coaches that we have hired to work with them. And here on the left-hand side, you can see the number of coaching sessions and what it will include, which is coaching, modeling, coaching, things like that. So then the question is this, okay, so we're spending all this time and effort on these things. How do we know it's actually happening? Well, there are two systems we're going to leverage. One's called KickUp and one's called eSuite. KickUp is what's going to be used for walkthroughs. So if I'm going to go walk into Mr. Hogg's classroom, I'm going to be walking through using the best practice rubric for small group instruction if that's my point of being there. I know if Mr. Hogg's working on small group instruction, that's what I'm going to watch. And I'm going to look for is within the small group instruction rubric based on the content area that he's teaching. So if you're doing literacy, I'm going to look for is around literacy. And we're going to track those things, what you see. And the reason we're doing that is because as a principal or as a system, we want to know where is it going really, really well and where do we need additional supports. Well, this system will allow us to look at it very finitely. You can kind of see on this screen a little bit, but we can get down to the granular level of which schools and which people are actually performing at proficient levels and where do we think that we need to work on things. And there's a whole heat map and things attached to it. So I go into Mr. Hogg's classroom, and he's doing amazing, of course. And then we go through the rubric. And now I have to actually have a coaching conversation with him because just going through the classroom and observing is not helpful. So if I'm going to be coaching him, then now I'm going to leverage that rubric and the information from KickUp, and I'm going to sit with Mr. Hogg, and we're going to actually have a coaching conversation based on his goal around small group instruction. And we're going to log all of that in eSuite. Well, the great thing about logging in an eSuite is we will be able to, and the people that are being coached will be able to see their own progress. And you can kind of see the badge progress as an example on the side. This is a sample person. I just put fake names in there. But as a system, we'll be able to see which teachers are being coached, which ones haven't, which coaches are actually making the time and able to get into the classrooms to coach the teachers, which ones are resulting in teachers making growth indicators, which teachers are badging under which coaches need more support because that's actually not occurring. We'll be able to see all of that in our system. So now we have systems in place to see, are people becoming proficient, and is the coaching model that we actually are implementing happening with fidelity? And the goal is that we'll see badges in best practice, and now I'll be able to marry those badging. Like if Stephen has 3 badges, I'll be able to look at his student outcomes and say, is there a relationship between his mastery of best practice and the students' outcomes that they're having? I can start to look statistically to see if there's actually an effect size. The last thing I want to just point out is PLCs and support coaching. So our coaches need lots of support. This is a big lift. So this is just a quick screenshot of all the different kinds of supports and trainings that they'll receive outside of their own coaching that they'll get on campuses. The last part I want to highlight before I turn the mic over to Dr. Brown, who will give you a few more slides and I think we'll answer questions, is around college and career and military readiness, because as Dr. Lopez said, this is a big part of our system. So we will be partnering, we were invited to partner with an organization called Education Strategy Group, which is, they're putting together a consortium of 5 systems, and they're naming it the Momentum Metrics Network. And basically the Momentum Metrics Network is gonna be 5 districts, and like I said, we were invited to participate. And the goal around this is to really help ensure that students are prepared to enter into their post-secondary world and that they're successful when they actually get there. And the focus primarily are on underrepresented students, so specifically Black, Hispanic, and low-income students. How do we make sure that this group of students who are typically underrepresented are actually going to be prepared and ready? And there are research-based metrics that they focus on. And so if you look at the slide, you can see it's divided into 3 kind of rows. One is around preparing, one is around applying, and then the last one is around, I can't read that, enrolling. Okay. So what you'll see across the top are what are the things that we know are important in order to make sure that students are successful. So 9th grade, are kids being successful and persistent in 9th grade and actually passing? Do they have potential for advanced coursework, and are we identifying who those kids actually are and making sure there's a high quality pathway for them to participate? Then we also look at when you start moving through your high school career, are you actually applying for college? Are you filling out your FAFSA, which now is a law, so everyone will? And also, are we matching you to universities and colleges that you want to go to and that you think you can be successful at? And then finally, how do we make sure there's actual enrollment into those places and that you're able to get to the point you're making earlier, that you've completed the gateway courses so that you're ready to actually be a participant. So with this group, we're actually putting together a committee that's going to be working with them over the course of this school year It's completely funded, grant funded. We don't have to pay one penny, but we will be coached and mentored to design a system that will allow us to monitor very specific targets to see that these things are actually occurring. And we're going to be focused on 4 main areas: college, career, military readiness, which is the system that we've been talking about, kids that are earning points, 9th grade on track, participation in post-secondary opportunities, and finally, college application. And so we're very excited about this because it's going to allow us to put a system in place that will refine our CCMR system, which is such a big portion of our outcomes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brown, and then I think we're going to go ahead and answer some questions for you.
Thank you, Dr. Wurtz. Good evening. So you heard a lot about today about accountability. You heard a lot about how we're going to ensure that instructional strategies are able to support changing outcomes for students. And today we're going to just talk briefly about the Office of School Leadership. We're really the implementation side of the house. So everything you heard earlier, how will it impact what's happening on the campus? And so in our department this year, we're focusing on 3 main priorities. Call it I3, I to the 3rd power. And the first I is to inspire a culture of high expectations for all. We know that we have challenging work ahead of us, but it does not mean that we lower our expectations for the work that our teachers and our students and our campus leadership are going to engage in. The second one is improve the quality of instruction. And you heard a significant amount of information from Dr. Wurtz that talks more specifically about how we're going to be able to do that with supports from the teaching and learning side as well as the campus leadership side. And then finally, ultimately increase student achievement for all students. And the campus leadership have heard me say several times already that all means all, that we are focusing on making sure that all of our students are achieving success. So this is a joint partnership. The Office of School Leadership, we work in tandem with teaching and learning. Everything that you saw in the previous slides, we've had a part in helping develop and support. And so we're excited to be able to pull these supports together to wrap ourselves around the campuses as they do the heavy lifting over the course of the coming year. So the Effective Schools Framework, we've talked about this quite a bit as it relates to campus improvement planning. And so lever 5 is around effective instruction. And so this will be, of course, a primary focus for our work this year with ESF, making sure that we have objective-driven daily lesson plans with formative assessments. Those instructional strategies are robust. You heard about our 4 best practices that we're focusing on this year. That really does capture those really solid instructional strategies. Data-driven instruction, which we talk about quite a bit, but our team is becoming even more proficient in ensuring that we're able to leverage data to make quality decisions around teaching and learning. And finally is RTI, response to intervention for students with learning gaps. Again, we've talked about that all night. We know we have some work to do, and so being as strategic as possible and ensuring that we're able to catch our students up as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the campus level supports that our principals and teachers will be privy to. Not an exhaustive list, but certainly some of these things. The first one is the instructional playbook. We're very proud of the instructional playbook this year, and I want to just kind of talk briefly about that, and we'll highlight one particular campus. We ask our campus leaders, our principals, to again review the data, the baseline data that you have for your school, and then we want you to spend some time looking at each of these specific plays for your campus. For example, when you look at play number 2, data-driven instruction, what are strategies that you are already engaging in on your campus? What artifacts do you have to support that? Where might be some gaps or priority work that you need to focus on as you enter the 21-22 school year? It goes all the way down to observation and feedback. What supports processes are in place? First, good teach instruction with literacy and mathematics. And so what you'll see here with this particular campus, which is Hill Elementary, I just kind of took some screenshots. So you'll see some of the specific plays and how they spent time really digging deep into this specific area and trying to determine what are some steps we can take. And why this is really important to our work this year as a department is our executive directors are working in tandem with our principals and our leadership teams to ensure that this playbook is central to everything that we do on that campus. When our principals and our teams write their campus improvement plans, which comes up in a couple of months, they're going to anchor it in this instructional playbook. And so every single campus in our district has an instructional playbook this year that we all have access to be able to really review, see where there might be some areas we can provide additional support. And then, of course, our executive directors are coaching our principals around this playbook. So I wanted to share just a couple of screenshots from that playbook. And some other campus level supports. We've been for the last couple of years involved with Region 11 in the Texas Instructional Leadership Initiative. This year we have 25 campuses who are a part of TEAL. And with that, they are engaging in, as a team, data-driven instructional practices. How do you work as a team to ensure your PLCs are effectively run, that you're leveraging the right data sources to be able to make instructional changes on your campus or in your instruction. And then many of these 25, about half of them, are actually being coached by a Region 11 coach, the principal is, and the executive director is being coached. So you can see that theme throughout our system is that we're making sure that everyone who has a touch point at the campus receives coaching to be able to support them in the best capacity as possible. You'll see elementary PLC support. And one thing we did during the pandemic is we tried to offer additional planning time for teachers at the elementary school level. And so with our ESSER funding this year, as you recall, we do have baseline supports that we've offered to all of our elementary schools. They'll either receive one teacher assistant or even 2 teacher assistants. And that is designed for them to be able to provide an extra 50 to 55 minute planning time or PLC time each week for the teacher. So that's going to really help with all the resources you've heard about tonight. How will they have time to be able to go through those and make a really solid lesson plan? So that elementary PLC support is going to be a big lever for us. Principal learning community triads. And so as you recall, our principals now are in smaller learning communities. We're calling them learning communities, and they're working in threes or fours, triads or quads. And what they're doing is focusing on that instructional playbook. Where are some gaps? Where are some problems they need to really kind of leverage peers to be able to, make some more solid decisions or make any adjustments to their plan. So they're really focusing on the importance of principals even being in learning communities for the upcoming year. And then about our ESSER baseline supports. We increased coaching capacity by adding instructional coaches to campuses who did not have an instructional coach. We also wanted to make sure we were able to relieve counselors. And so the addition of the testing facilitator positions on campus. Our campuses are currently hiring for those positions, but it's going to provide counselors now opportunity to really focus on SEL, and then now you have a full-time person who can focus on testing, data analysis, and support the leadership team as well. And then our AISD leads. You all know we've spent quite a bit of time on our leadership development. That will continue. And so this year we have a year-long professional learning series for principals, APs, and deans called AISD Leads. And it really is focused on strengthening their own personal leadership of self and then leadership of others. And then we also have teacher leadership training this year with our department leads and level leads. In fact, we had our kickoff launch a couple of days ago where every single teacher leader in Arlington, whether you're grade level or department lead, had a foundational leadership training course. And that will continue throughout the year because we know it's going to take a whole lot more than just the principal or the AP helping to move the instructional needle. It's going to take our teacher leaders who are helping support each other as well. And so we're very excited about these campus level supports. And again, this partnership with teaching and learning really ensures that the design side of the house is communicating with the implementation side, working in tandem to be able to help change outcomes for students. So Dr. Wurtz is happy to take any questions that you might have. We're happy to take any questions from you all.
First of all, Dr. Lopez, Dr. Wurtz, Dr. Brown, I call this a trifecta. Yes. Really appreciate the depth of information that you provided. And not only that, but the excitement that we can hear out of your voices as to what you're explaining to us. So I hope that ignites the whole district as we continue to move forward. So I just want to say that. Do I have any questions from any of my colleagues? Ms. McMurray?
This is going to be the tricky part because my question is about a slide, and I think I got the slide number right, but we might be a little off because there were a lot of slides. I think it was slide number 62, if it's labeled right. It's the one that shows I put it down, hang on. The rubric for the Engage to Learn coaching session, I believe. There we go. Was that 62?
Yes.
Okay. So I am familiar with this, having taught for the district, and I know that this is going to be implemented heavily as it has been in the past, even more so, especially with last year kind of hitting the pause button. I do know that technology is a big factor in this rubric, and technology is a great tool. I just think we need to be careful with that, especially when rating our teachers, because remember, we're climbing out of a pandemic, and pencil and paper address so many things, such as fine motor skills. We actually have handwriting teaks. I think that we just need to keep that in mind, because these rubrics, and I know it's hard to see, but this is just one piece of the rubric, differentiation and scaffolding. But the whole thing encompasses technology, every single thing. So that's the one caveat that I have, and something I just think we need to be wary of, because pencil and paper, it's still a thing. And, technology is a great tool. I just think, I've heard from a lot of parents as well that screen time, we just need to be very cautious not to overdo it.
So can I respond to
Please,
that? So
please.
there are two rubrics. One is just the regular, I call the regular rubric. And then this one, the ones that you see in front of you are the best practices for blended learning is what it's called. So you're right. And what happened is the technology was infused through all parts of it. The intent is not to replicate what happened during the pandemic and have everyone on computers all the time and do that. Because I wholeheartedly agree with you. You want kids engaged in all types of learning. Technology is one resource. We don't want kids just on their computers all day. The reason why it's embedded in there is because what we don't want to do is lose momentum in technology integration in our system that we actually acquired through this process. So I agree with you. I think that's going to be an important part of the coaches to make sure that the idea is not to be punitive in any way to a teacher and say we have to use all these things and do it all in a blended environment. Some of your lessons won't at all. We just want to be thoughtful about the fact that it's not being forgotten.
That's wonderful. I just don't ever want it to even be interpreted that technology could hinder a teacher's evaluation, because the teacher should have the discretion as to when to incorporate technology. And our teachers have become really good at that, whether they wanted to or not, right? One more thing, I really like how you use medical metaphors a lot. I think that there's so many parallels we can draw, with our diagnosis and all that. But something I also want to, throw into that medical metaphor is good doctors always listen to their patients. You have to listen to your patients. You have to have that good bedside manner too. And so I hope that we are doing that with our teacher leaders, in PLCs. I think that that's key. I really appreciate that you agreed to do the Engage to Learn survey, because I think that will fill in gaps, give us a story that the data is not telling us. We've got to listen to our patients. And so something that I would really like to do during our workshop is look at this again and just kind of maybe hopefully set some goals beyond STAAR, right? And think about what you've just presented to us will glean. We all have lofty goals. That's why we're all in this room. But I'm really grateful we're doing a workshop, because this is a lot to take in, and you all have done phenomenal work, and you're collaborating with your campus leadership, with your teachers, and that's huge. We have the foundation. I just think that we've got a lot of heavy lifting to do, and we're gonna do that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McMurrow. Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, President Mays. And what do we call it? The trifecta? So a lot of information, a lot of good stuff as always, Dr. Wurtz and Dr. Brown. I like the focus. thought I had a question for you, but I do want to say I like how your piece was aligned to the effective school framework. And I think my guess is now more than ever, we need to really elevate DDI and make sure everyone gets it in rapid pace so that we're ready, because that's going to be, my guess is that's an important lever that's going to, a high yield lever that's going to give us a chance to really affect change on the, what do we call it, the unfinished learning. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you. Who put that out? Council of Great City Schools, yeah. So, so this was great. I think what I have is really kind of some wish list items that maybe we talk about when we dive a little bit deeper, and maybe hopefully that you're planning to address with us. This, as always, very thorough in terms of how we're, especially how we're going to leverage coaching, which is a high yield strategy, right? And but my question is, how are we going? My first question is, how are we as a board, how are you going to report back to us on to measuring our progress in terms of recapturing that or accelerating that unfinished learning? I'm trying to not use learning loss, and I'm having a tough time. Yeah. The effects of COVID. So you mentioned reliance on screeners. Currently, we don't get reported out. Typically, we haven't because of the pandemic, where we are on the CAs. But in terms of the board being able to monitor progress on moving the needle, how do you envision that will look?
Well, really, honestly, it's up to you all and Dr. Cavasso to decide how you want us to present it to you. The data points we have available to us are screeners and CAs. We don't have access to teachers' formative assessments. They are designed to be done in the classroom. We do provide resources for them to create unit assessments, and we have what we call unit summative assessments that we actually publish that they could use, but we don't capture them at the system level. The data we capture at the system level are benchmarks, CAs, and screener data. The important thing to keep in mind is the data that we shared with you tonight is the point in time of last school year with that cohort of students, which based on our own mobility rate is probably about 20 to 25% different than the group of kids we're actually seeing today in each of these schools. So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of the mind. So when we get to this school year, I think the screener data and the CA one at the very beginning is a really good baseline for us to understand, like, what are we actually dealing with this group of students today in comparison to what we know they should know. We can do what we typically do. Like, there's ways to do analyses, for example, and say, okay, this cohort of first grade students landed around here. Typically, we see them around here. Is that a lot or a little? You know, we can kind of do those kinds of things, but the screener data is going to be new. The important other thing to keep in mind that's going to be kind of challenging for us is the screener data this year is going to be different. We've used iStation for years. We're moving to M-Class, which is required by the commissioner or the TA. They gave us an option of a couple, and M-Class is the one that we went with through most of them.
I mean, iStation's used like thousands of districts.
Not anymore.
Really?
You can leave iStation in place, which we'll have for people to use for interventions and things like that if they want to. But the reality is yeah, it's not on the list for many districts are moving to M-Class. In fact, it's pretty common.
And who's the provider for M-Class? Is it?
It's called M-Class. Amplify. You've seen that if you've been.
Yeah.
So M-Class is one. The other thing that is our current screener for mathematics will give you a quantile score at the end, but it doesn't necessarily tell you where the building blocks of math are challenging. So we're going through a process this year to find a new screener for math. So I just think it's important to bring those things to point. I'll re-emphasize or mention that when we share that kind of data with you. What are the challenges with this data? What can we glean from it? What are some questions we still have? The important thing I think to remember when it comes to data, which we will do, is it's about triangulation. Really, it's like I have STAAR data, I have screener data, I have CA data. what do these 3 things tell me about the person that we're learning about? And we, as a system, will look at it from a systems point of view. But to Ms. McMurrow's point, a teacher has so much more information, and a
Right.
campus has so much more information. So our goal
Formative
is to
assessments.
support them when they say there's challenges along the way. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the one thing I would like, I mean, it's so important this year. I mean, we see where we are. And so I would like, as a board, for us, once we get a good baseline measurement of those pre-assessments, we know all the flaws of STAAR, right? We know it looks bad, but we don't know, is it really bad? And if so, just how bad? So as we're collecting those pre-assessments at the beginning of the year, if that's collectible enough that we can look at system-wide, aggregate up, and report back as soon as possible to the board. I know we're going to go off and strategize on what we want to see, but that's going to take time. But in the meantime, I think because we can't rely on STAAR, we need that pre-assessment. And we as a board need to know where we are as a district.
Well, those screeners aren't going to give you a projection, and that's the challenge. You're not going to be able to look at the way we had set up our model before, because we had so many years of iStation. We actually had a model in place where we could say, if you score this way in kindergarten, this is what your projected score in 3rd grade is going to be if we don't solve it. We don't have that ability to do now because M-Class is brand new. And in fact, we won't be able to project that until the kindergarten person has a score in kinder and then a score in 3rd grade. So we can't, there's some gaps that we're going to have in terms of our challenges. We will be able to still equate projections for the end of the year based on CAs. We still can do that the way we've done in the past, like our CA scores that we've leveraged. We've been able to put a model to it to give you a projection about which schools are actually high performing or struggling. And honestly, there's never been a school that's landed on the F list that we haven't seen coming from a mile away. So we can still do that. But the farther we get along in the school year, the more refined that gets. So the CA1, we have a projection. It really gets a lot more refined once you get to CA2 and the benchmark. But it's just the nature of the way that it kind of works. It's not, we're kind of handicapped a little bit because we don't have longitudinal data over multiple years because the tools we're using are new.
Right, and yeah.
I know, it's not
And I
great
think,
news.
no, but I think to Mr. Wilbank's point, that's part of our task in the work session. Here are the data points we have, here are the systems we use, here are the tools we use, here's their advantages, disadvantages, or strengths and weaknesses, whatever. And then it's our task to also recommend, here's the frequency that it should be elevated to the board as a recommendation or as a starting point, draft, call it what you want. But it's our task as we deal with this every day with our campuses to say, here's what a campus views and this is the frequency. Here's what we recommend or draft as a starting point for board, and then get board input about these things are important, these things we want to elevate. This is why this tool we need to see more frequent, less frequent, et cetera. That's the beauty of the work session, in my opinion, so that we can calibrate around those things, because then that leads to alignment. It leads to the alignment of what's actually happening, as Ms. McMurrow has mentioned, in the classroom and the analysis. That happens all the way to district level, and then the alignment all the way to the board, which is when you really have that strong team approach.
That is so important, Dr. Cavazos, and I really look forward to doing that. It's just with this particular problem that we have now with the usefulness of STAAR and how critical we do that baseline analysis of where we are. And that's where I was hoping that we could develop a plan. I know the school's starting Monday, but we could do that baseline analysis and at least be able to report that out in some way. But that's fine. We can talk about that more, possibilities around that further. In terms of your department, and I think what's useful for you is, we have a lot of measurements of achievement, right? Of did someone master or fail a particular TEK or fail a STAAR? I think, to me, the framework that's more imperative, given the amount of growth that actually has to occur from where we know kids are from where they need to be, is measuring that growth. And I know MAP, is that what you use in Mansfield? Both math and reading provide you those really strong growth indicators, not just whether a student passed or failed. Do we have that same ability using the tools that we have at our disposal, and feel free to share your thoughts if you think I'm on base by thinking we also need to zone in on growth in particular in addition to achievement.
Right, and MAP is actually one that we're considering for mathematics, for the reasons that you're describing. I think growth is definitely something we can actually measure as we're moving along, especially from CAs to CAs. The interesting thing about CAs is that while they're assessing what students learned during that 6-week time period, there's also a level of accumulation that we kind of add into, so we can make sure that what you mastered in 6 weeks is not lost in the second 6 weeks, so to speak. And we do all the scaling like you would normally expect in STAAR. So, for example, we often get this question when a student takes the STAAR test. Well, what's the passing score? It's not just passing. We do the same things you would normally do in a test. There are questions that are thrown out. There's a whole scaling process that we do that goes into the model that allows us to do this predictive kind of scenario. So we can see how kids are growing. We can see how kids are growing over the course of the year. And we can definitely, of course, use STAAR. And our screeners are intended to show you growth over time. That's the whole point in my mind of a screener, is it shows you how to look at something in smaller chunks and watch if a student's progressing. One of the examples I gave to principals maybe like a week ago was this idea around Lexile levels, for example, and reading levels, Fountas and Pinnell reading levels, things like that. When a student is at a DRA 4 or 5 in kindergarten, you want them to be at a 16 in first grade. At 4 or 5 at the beginning of first grade, you want them to be at a 16 by the end of first grade. I have to know that they're progressing in the levels along the way at the right pace to make sure that they get to the end point on time.
That's exactly my point.
Screeners are intended to help you to do that. They're intended to help you figure out how to fill in the gaps and understand where kids are so they reach that destination that you're intending to get to.
Yeah, it's just a matter of, hey, we got this long to get them here, and this is
Right.
the rate of growth. Or at this rate of growth, are they going to make it? Or do we need more interventions?
Right.
Excuse my ignorance, it's just we as a board, I know several districts routinely get report outs on their screener data from iStation or MAP and those growth measures periodically, and that's something we'll be looking at adding in terms of report outs that we would like to see as well. The other thing that, to use your example that you used earlier, is you talked about kind of examining where the deficiencies are that might prevent a student from being on target or on grade level, and you use the example of phonetic awareness. Let's say if we want kids to be reading on grade level 3, we got to start instilling that early on, right, in kindergarten and first grade. Are our screeners able to give teachers that real-time intervention data that, okay, take the 5 domains of reading that, especially early childhood literacy in those early grades, and really refocus them on?
That's what it does, yeah.
Okay, good. And then finally, my last question is, this is great, and I think in terms of the wish list of what I would like to see is, you guys sound like you have it covered in the classroom and classroom instruction with the necessary leadership support and coaching supports. But what are those other strategies that we see our other districts utilizing in terms of doing outside the classroom and aligning the after school and before school, and maybe doing Saturday enrichments and summer school, and providing other strategies to do other time to provide those supports and interventions for those kids who need it?
So we're working with Aaron Perales to establish after-school care that's actually embedding our tutoring program into it. House Bill 4545 requires that all students who didn't take the assessment or who failed any portion of the assessment receive 30 hours of additional tutoring time. It has to happen before school, after school, or embedded in the school day. And so we actually have a system where we're looking at school schedules and how can we make sure that students get access to it, because you can't supplant the tutoring time for core instruction time. So if I failed math, I have to go to my full math block, and I still need my extra time for tutoring. It's a very difficult law to actually implement, just to be frank with you. It's a completely unfunded mandate and requires an enormous amount of staff. The commissioners basically said, do your best, and if you're trying your best, we won't bother you. We're gonna try to do it the very best we can, but the reality is we know that some kids may or may not need all of that. So any student that wasn't assessed last year, we're gonna assess them at the beginning of the year to see if you even need this, or actually, are you actually okay? So we'll be doing that. And then in terms of Saturday and enrichment programs, we'll still work with campuses to support them in that process. A lot of that is very individualized by the school based on the needs and the interests that the kids actually have. But we're closely working with Aaron Perala's department to help make sure that the wraparound service that we provide are actually including the academic intervention times that we know are going to have to provide to students. So those are actual strategies we do have. I didn't highlight them tonight, but that doesn't mean they're not being planned.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be helpful as a board, maybe as a, study at home document, to get a one pager of our comprehensive list of strategies that we're using specifically to overcome the unfinished learning. I mean, for instance, one other thing, and I apologize, I have more than one last question to my colleagues, but so, one of the questions I have is, kind of using the framework of our federal programs and how we're augmenting our federal programs like Title III. What are we doing for our EL students who we know suffered a lot because of COVID and are going to need really intensive and targeted interventions? We didn't really talk about kind of what are we doing in more intensive PSYOP training for the teachers, for
We have
those
sheltered instruction.
or sheltered instruction, yeah. So there's, I have a million questions in terms of, what does it look like for each targeted group that we know suffered disproportionately? And what are we doing to bring those kids up? I mean, I'm not expecting an answer right now, but those are kind of the questions I would like to dive deeper in and find out.
One thing I just want to emphasize is and I'm not suggesting you're saying this, so that's not what I'm trying to say, but there isn't some special strategy that that districts have been holding in their back pocket that they can pull out to solve the problem that's current today. Best practice is best practice. So like the things you're highlighting are actually best practice, like sheltered instruction, PSYOP. We have tools in place to help our students actually improve their reading and writing skills specifically for ELs. All these things are actually great things. Even the best practice I highlighted earlier, they're research-based best practice. The goal is how do you accelerate it so that they're actually happening across the system, being done proficiently within all of the schools. And that's the challenge of the system that's as large as Arlington. But there really isn't like even the districts that are around the state, they're accelerating work that they've already started or work that they actually know is research-based. Most people are not. There isn't a special strategy. There is a way of doing things better. For example, summer school is a great example. We had a huge number of students participate in summer school this year, 11,000. That's more than we've ever had before. That's a way of accelerating and giving access to kids. Having more kids engaged in this idea of accelerated learning through additional tutoring with people who are actually certified and they're using a very structured program, that's a strategy. So I think that's our target. And one of the things we've actually talked about to the team is we're not trying to make a sharp right turn. What we're trying to do is do what we know is research-based, but make sure it's pervasive, that we model it, that we monitor it, and we make sure people are supported in that process. And like you're describing, there are so many strategies that we have that we work on that I didn't highlight tonight. You mentioned many of them tonight, but no one of these things that we're talking about is actually going to solve the problem. It's almost like you described, it's the combination of them together.
Yeah. We're gonna have to bring out all the tools that are in our toolkits that we know are effective, right? Our favorite tools, and it's just a lot.
Right.
When I look at the numbers, it's going to be a heavy lift, and we owe it to pull out every trick in our toolkit because we got to prevent this temporary loss from becoming a generational loss.
Right. I totally agree.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Wellbanks. And I just have to kind of piggyback a little bit off of what he said, which is why I think it's so important that we look at our leadership for the district and understand that because of the leadership that's been put in place, that we can then trust for all these things that you couldn't even mention tonight, and you still did a very long presentation. I'm very glad that we get to sit in the position of asking you, once you've done your work, what's the results?
Right.
Because you're doing a lot of work behind the scenes. Ms. McMorrow?
One more brief question that I meant to roll in to when it was my turn. I apologize for taking another one, but slide 68, I think I'm right on this. Can we go back to that slide? It was the TEACS resource system, leveraging resources. Okay, maybe not. Maybe that's not it.
This one?
There it is, yes. So just a quick clarification question. I know that when we were looking at this document here, Resources for Accelerated Tier 1 Instruction, you mentioned that it tells you in this document where teachers can find said resources. Why aren't they just hyperlinked? Because isn't this a hyperdoc?
There are in there. You can see parts of them that are hyperlinked and parts of them that aren't. That's
Okay.
just an example.
I was just clarifying, because again, back to the medical metaphor, when we go to get our prescription, we need to make sure we're not waiting in line too long, getting a medicine that might or might not be what I need, and that is where the resources are really going to help our teachers beef up their instruction. And I'm grateful that our district acknowledged that, and that was on our ESSER funding list. We need to really be intentional about not only beefing up the resources, but ensuring that they're aligned to the standards. They're high quality enough to put in front of our children. And I know that's what teachers are wanting. I know that that's what teachers have stated in prior surveys. So I'm really excited about that, and making them accessible like this, that lessens another hurdle. That takes the teacher right to the prescription, and it looks like they're going to have more so that they can fit their needs of the specific students in their classroom. So even though first day of school is right around the corner, this is something that looks like it's ready to rock. So I'm really excited about that. I think that that's huge. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. McMorrow. Dr. Reich?
Thank you, President Mays. To all three of you, thank you so very much for the information. As I have said numerous times on this dais, I love the intelligent approach. This is going to, I would think, get us to the goals, even though they're heavy lifts that we're all seeking here. It's just phenomenal. From a governance standpoint, I'm looking at the outcomes, I'm looking at what the results are on the metrics and that type of thing. And one of the things that excited me, because we just don't know, we throw all of these things at achievement, and we don't know this is what made this lever move. And you and it's interesting that you're on this coaching slide here. Coaching is a high yield device for sure. In my company, we've incorporated that with hospitals and health systems for after skills training, et cetera, going through for individuals, CPD plans, continuing professional development plans. It's exponential growth in performance and patient safety and outcomes. And what excited me was when you were saying that with these data systems, you'll be able to take and actually see the correlation of the coaching and the student performance. My interest from a governance standpoint is what's the timetable you think that you'll be able to start seeing that type of correlation to report back to us?
It really is going to be about the pace of the coaching that the teachers go through. Remember, our goal is that they earn and master all 4 of the best practices over a 3-year time period, because each best practice that you would badge for has growth indicators, so specific things that you would do, and when you master those things, you actually earn the badge. So what we'll look for is, one, our teacher, how how many growth indicators, how many coaching sessions does it typically take for teachers to earn a certain number of growth indicators, and how quickly are the badges happening? And then is there a relationship between the teachers who have earned badges and their outcomes that they're having with kids? So it's going to take a little bit of time because we have to have mastery around badges, and then I have to decide which specific outcomes I'm trying to tie it to. Typically, the way we wanted to look at it was around the vitals at the district level. So when we get to the end of next school year, for example, we should be able to see, okay, what were the STAAR scores, for example, in this third grade teacher's classroom, and is there a relationship between the badging that he or she did and their outcome that they actually had with kids? As you get farther along, you could probably get more granular in terms of like screeners and things like that, but we have to keep in mind of what the purpose of certain assessments are. Screener assessments are really more formative in nature. They're supposed to guide a teacher's direction and decision making. It's not supposed to be summative in nature, whereas a STAAR score is summative in nature. And so the idea really is to more marry your coaching with your summative outcomes, not necessarily your formative outcomes. So that's probably where our initial starting point will be. So it's probably more like this time next year, or actually in the spring.
Okay. And then the only other question I have from a budgeting standpoint, I'm thinking that a lot of the dollars are coming from our ESSER.
There's a portion of, there's about $12 million of ESSER funds that are attached to coaching, but that's just one strand of many of the things.
Right.
It doesn't include like any kind of, there's other dollars set aside for the hiring of staff and the things that Dr. Brown kind of talked about, but the actual coaching, there is an item in there that's about 12 million.
Yeah, and the only reason I'm asking is obviously that's like a grant kind of thing that's going to go away, and we're going to hopefully see that, yeah, the correlation is there, and we want to keep
Right.
that, and we need to absorb that into our regular budget.
Well, the interesting thing that I'm glad you actually mentioned that, that's the reason why we really want to leverage this idea with Engage to Learn, because we don't plan on staying married to Engage to Learn.
Mhm.
Engage to Learn is here to help us build capacity, and then we fly on our own. So with ESSER funds, we can hire Engage to Learn coaches to work with our coaches and work with teachers with a gradual release. So eventually, like on third year, they're way down reduced and they go away, and we're completely doing it on our own. But now I don't have a bunch of staffing challenges because I have all these coaches don't work for us. So there's strategy around the reason why we leveraged Engage to assist with this process, because we wanted to build capacity, but we didn't want to have to deal with trying to figure out how to maintain it when that staffing formula couldn't be maintained over time because it's way too expensive. So that was part of our strategy.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you again very much. I'm so appreciative of not just these strategies, but the fact that even though we have, I would err on the side of somewhat worthless data from last year's assessments, that you have taken the bull by the horns and jumped on this, and that we have all this in place and the data analysis before school begins. When I first came on this board, that was not the case, and we were looking at it in December best, January usually, and it just didn't make any sense to make any effective steps and gains. So thank you very much for what you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. I see no more lights on. Once again, thank you for the presentation, and I think we all are looking forward to our additional meet.
Okay.
Okay, next on our agenda is our open forum for non-agenda items. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have any requesters registered to address the board regarding non-agenda items?
Yes, ma'am. Our first registered requester for non-agenda item is Blanca Martinez. Is Blanca Martinez here in the room, or is she on the Zoom? No, ma'am, she's not here. Our next speaker after that is Kelly Joel. Is Kelly Joel here? No. Our third speaker, was going to be via Zoom. It's Mr. Wendell Byfield, and he is on Zoom, so we'll bring him in.
Okay.
Okay, I'm here.
Mr. Byfield, before your time starts, let me just read our protocol. The second open forum segment of the meeting provides citizens with an opportunity to address the trustees on any subject except personnel. This is not intended to be a discussion or a debate, and trustees will not reply to the speakers. Derogatory comments aimed at an individual will not be tolerated. You will have 3 minutes to speak. Mrs. Benjamin will notify you when your time is up, and please end your presentation at that time. Okay, Mr. Byfield, your time starts now.
Great. Thank you. I wanted to make some comments regarding the district's approach last year and provide some information in the hope that this year's approach will be fundamentally different. I think everyone would agree from a school perspective, last year was not a good year. I think we just saw that with the STAAR results. It was awful. It was awful for teachers, parents, students, especially for the high school students who were kept from attending full time until the very end of the school year. Unless the goal was to minimize in-person attendance, Arlington's unique approach with the high school hybrid model did not work. Attendance peaked at the beginning when it was first offered, then it died off. There was no ability for students to establish a routine by going to school in person one day, but then not the next day, all while trying to keep track of what week was on what schedule. The only way they could really establish a rhythm or consistency was to stay home every day instead of just every other day, and that's what most students soon did. As a result, Arlington has a much lower in-person attendance numbers, especially in high school, than the other districts did in the area. And I think it's very likely that the hybrid model and the other policies Arlington implemented discouraging in-person attendance is a primary explanation for what everybody was just talking about, the lower STAAR numbers than the state average. And I think it'd be easier for the board and the district to simply discount the STAAR numbers from last year, but I hope you all don't take the easy way out. The policies that were chosen for our district last year and this year have serious and long-lasting consequences. According to Tarrant County Public Health, there have been 2 COVID deaths in the county in children under age of 15. But there were zero student COVID deaths in Arlington ISD. But there are other less serious, or there are other severe, but still very serious consequences that will never be reported. For example, how many Arlington students just dropped out of the system because it was too hard with the hybrid model? How many missed graduating? What are the lifelong impacts our community will experience because of this? The goal of our school district cannot be to simply minimize COVID infections regardless of any other consequence. There are very real and long-lasting impacts due to the decisions that are being made and how the district limits access to in-person school. COVID's going to be with us for a very long time. Everybody should expect that cases where people receive the vaccine will still get COVID. The Johnson & Johnson trial had an efficacy rate of 67%, and that means 1 out of every 3 people in that trial got the vaccine, then got COVID. The important benefit is the vaccine keeps a reduction in hospitalizations and deaths, and so I highly encourage everybody to go get the vaccine. You help yourself out and you help everybody else out by reducing the chance of passing it on or taking up critical hospital space. Finally, I encourage those in administration making the calls this school year to consider the impact their decisions have from a fuller, more holistic perspective. Also, let's take the opportunity to learn from others. We can look at how other districts with campuses that were both larger and smaller than those in Arlington were able to make full-time in-person work last year at all levels, including high school. And I hope the board members will consider requesting a survey or reaching out to those districts if Arlington takes on a unique approach again. And finally, I had a specific request from a student to confirm that masks cannot be mandated during extracurricular activities like sports, band, or choir. The executive order makes no exception based on school activity, and I was hoping you can confirm that masks will not be mandated in any extracurricular. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Byfield. Is that the last of our speakers, Mrs.
Yes,
Benjamin?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Okay, next on our agenda is our superintendent's report. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, President Mays, and in the spirit of PowerPoint and slides, these are just a few. So we recently had our first ever pre-K Palooza at Adams Elementary. It was designed to get pre-K students registered in one stop with everything from language assessments to qualifications. Thanks to the hard work of our early childhood learning team under the direction of Dr. Jacqueline Orsini, we had 150 students get registered for pre-K just in these events, and I'd like to thank everyone for their hard work. You see some of the pictures there of the fun time that pre-Kers had, and that'll continue as we get ready for school. Speaking of hard work, and Dr. Wurtz mentioned this earlier, our summer learning program was expanded this summer to record numbers. We had more than 11,000 students, as you heard earlier in the report, enroll for summer learning, with everything from enrichment classes to accelerated classes being offered to students. It was really a tremendous undertaking, at nearly 5,000 more students involved in this program than the previous summer or previous summers. Classes offered in person and virtually. Meals and transportation were also provided. It was a huge undertaking. I want to thank Sincerely, the staff that made this possible, because after the year and still teaching summer school in this way, in a new way, an engaging way for summer programming was very, very tall task, and they met it with flying colors. So thank you to all the staff, to all the students and families that participated. This was a success. Our school year hasn't yet started, and we already have students making the news across the Metroplex. Congratulations to Imani from Lamar High School. Imani is a senior to be at Lamar High School, and if you missed her story in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram or on our website, you'll soon be able to read about her in the Dallas Morning News. Her story is an amazing one that it's culminating with her being named the Boys and Girls Club of Tarrant County's Youth of the Year. And she's also the class president at Lamar. And so congratulations already to Imani. School hasn't even started, and look what she's been able to accomplish. And then finally, we hope to see people and volunteers, and thank you to them, at AT&T Stadium for a drive-by Saturday with 7th annual back-to-school kickoff. Like last year, this event will be drive-through. All of the 10,000 backpacks filled with school supplies have already been accounted for, which is amazing. This event would not be possible without all of our sponsors and community support that we receive. And I'd like to thank in advance the more than 500 people who have already signed up to volunteer for this event. This is truly an event that demonstrates a love that our community has and that our volunteers have for young people, and to make sure that they have a backpack and they have the supplies they need to start off school just the right way. And of course, it's sponsored by the Gene and Jerry Jones Family Foundation with their generous donation every year to make this possible. So also a big thank you to Aaron Perales for leading the organization of all of this event for so many years. So with that, I conclude my report.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cavazos. Okay, for trustee reports, Mrs. Fowler.
Thank you, President Mays. On a personal note, I want to do a shout out to Matt Lilly. He's a Corey dad and the owner of True Blue HVAC. He came to my family's rescue. We came back from Mexico to no air conditioning, and it was 91 degrees upstairs. And so I asked for some recommendations, and Gara Hill is actually the one who texted me and recommended Matt Lilly and his company. Came out the next morning, little bitty part, was gone in 15 minutes, and the house was cool. So I appreciate Matt Lilly of True Blue HVAC for coming to my family's rescue.
Thank you, Mrs. Fowler. Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, President Mays. I had the privilege last night of going to Urban Alchemy, where the Chamber of Commerce recognized the high school student award winners in their entrepreneur contest. Much belated celebration. They actually celebrated the team from Seguin High School from 2 years ago, Martin High School, Team Redivis, who actually created a mobile phone app so you could scan barcodes and determine what's the best way to recycle that item. So that was the 2020 winner that didn't get to have their celebration. And then they also celebrated last year's winner, which was Team Mink, I believe is how you pronounced it, from Seguin High School, who also kind of in the theme of recycling, created a program to take in electronics and safely recycle electronic equipment that have a lot of harmful chemicals that could endanger the environment if they were just thrown into the landfill. These kids are amazing. They took to the networking event and networked, asked for leads on help for their app and for possible leads for investors. As a former, or I guess existing entrepreneur, once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur, I was very impressed that these kids are going far. So again, kudos to the Chamber for doing such an important program, instilling entrepreneurship in our students here at AISD. And also thank you to the partners in education group there that are really doing a lot to allow our students to explore and realize their dreams post-school. So thank you to the chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Mrs. McMurray.
It's been a while since we've had a board meeting, and a lot has occurred since then. About a month ago, I had the pleasure of visiting virtually with our 2021 Ignite committee, led by the incredibly dedicated and innovative Anita Foster. She's our Executive Director of Marketing and Communication, and I cannot put into words the wonderful work that you've done and your committee. And, you know, even though we did have to decide, and it was cutting it really close date-wise, but even though we did make the decision to forego our in-person convocation at AT&T Stadium, I want you and everyone on the Ignite committee to know your work was not done in vain. You didn't skip a beat. You already are planning for our virtual version, our pre-recorded version of convocation. And I don't think I've ever seen you not smiling. That's just who you are. Even with the mask, I could see your smile. And Anita, I want you to know that that's infectious. And the whole point of convocation is to inspire and ignite. And virtual or not, that is what you do every day, convocation or not. And I just want to thank you and your committee for your awesome work. Thank you.
Hear, hear, Mrs. McMurray. Thank you so much.
Yeah, let's.
Thank you, Mrs. Foster. Okay, I see no more lights on. I just want to end this section with just saying I think how excited we all are about the start of school. The beginning of school always seems to set off a beginning, a chance over, a do-over. And I just really hope that everyone is excited. We're looking forward to seeing the students come back. I know the teachers are excited about seeing their students. I do want to say, just to piggyback off of you, Mrs. McMurray, to our bus drivers, to our cafeteria workers, to our janitors, to our clerks in the school, we will have an all-together gathering to kick off a school year at some point where everyone is included, and that I am looking forward to. So I just wanted to say one little quote. Where's Dr. Wurtz? There they go. Okay, I'm summing up y'all's professional educational verbiage in simple, small words. Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Arthur Ashe. Okay, Ms. Secretary, do we have any items to consider?
We do. Mr. Wilbanks recommending changes to the budget to actuals for Ms. Moss. That's it.
Okay.
Through the finance committee.
Yeah, I'm going to go through the finance
Put
committee.
that on there.
Thank you, Ms. Secretary.
To the finance.
It is now 10:35 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned.